Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third in our seminar series, Grenfell and Academic Inquiry, hosted by Bangor University and the Bartlett School of Construction and Project Management at UCL. My name is Vanessa Davies. I'm an independent consultant and I've got an academic, policy, legal and regulatory background. My co-chair today is Michael Bowsher QC, to whom we're very grateful for bringing together a range of speakers who will focus on the fundamental problem of coordination and procuring building services and contracts. Our series started 2 weeks ago with a much wider span. We've moved from the socio-historical through the regulatory, and now might be thought to be looking at rather more abstract, theoretical and technical legal questions. You could be forgiven for thinking that we've travelled further and further away from the human. So to make sure that we stay anchored and never forget the real nature of the Grenfell tragedy, I'd like us once more to take that moment of quiet reflection before the seminar gets underway. Thank you. So just a few bits of housekeeping before I hand over to Michael. We'll use the question and answer function bottom. You should see that at the bottom of your screens for you to put questions to the panel, and I'll try to field those fairly. If we run into time, there should be a small space for questions about the individual papers to their authors, and then more general discussion points as well at the end of each segment. If you'd like to make a more general observation rather than ask a specific question, please use the chat function for that. We've made a few small adjustments to the published running order, and we'll explain those as we go along. So let me start then the main proceedings by introducing Michael Bowsher QC. Michael's a specialist in public procurement, competition and commercial law, particularly in disputes concerning major public and public-private projects. He's particularly well known for his unique practice in regulated procurement in the UK, in Ireland and elsewhere in the EU and beyond. He's appeared as counsel in many of the major procurement cases over more than a decade. Michael's also a visiting professor at King's College London, where he teaches EU public procurement on the LLM degree and is director of a distance learning diploma and masters in public procurement law. He's a member of the bar in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland, and he practices actively there as well as in England and Wales. And he blogs about what he does too. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much indeed, Vanessa. It's a great pleasure and honour to be involved in this event today, which takes really quite a practical look at how tragedies such as Grenfell at least are maybe partly a consequence of the way in which the systems we've developed in this country for procuring building services and building contracts have evolved. There's obviously a number of factors involved here, and we'll try and explore those as we go. To some extent, of course, we're tracking across the subject matter of the Grenfell inquiry as it currently, the current phase of the inquiry, and so perhaps we need to be a little bit careful that we don't make assumptions or preempt the outcome of that. But we've all, in our different ways, will have been following the event. Some of us are actually involved in it. Not myself. I'm just a bystander, sort of picking up what I can from press and so forth, but we're able at least to pick up some of the themes that are emerging from that. Those of us who've been involved in procurement in different ways, I'm afraid, probably have found all too often when we hear sort of news from the inquiry, we think, well, yes, that's tragic, but that's not really news. I've been saying that's been happening for 20 or 30 years. You know, I mean, there have been so many themes coming out of the inquiry which have made one think, gosh, that's just an echo of this, that, or the other event that we've been involved in at different times. We come to the participants in this panel come with quite a different set of perspectives. but from academia, from practice. But I hope that at the end we'll be able to put together an interesting mixture. And at the end, in the discussion session, I look forward to having being joined by Professor Caranta, who's professor at Turin, who will bring an important comparative aspect from an Italian perspective to demonstrate that unfortunately we're not the only jurisdiction that has problems such as this, but also it's often valuable to see how some of the systemic problems we're dealing with are how they're dealt with in other systems, how they've brought out problems elsewhere, so that if we're trying to learn and improve, what lessons we can learn from that. So, unfortunately, just to say a little bit about what we're going to do, we're going to start with Richard Craven, who is going to focus on the Grenfell Tower disaster as a case study of decision making and how that has led to some of the problems which we are beginning to see revealed in the course of the inquiry. Unfortunately, Professor Albert Sanchez-Grails is unable to join us, but fortunately, Albert Sanchez-Grails and I have spent a long enough time discussing procurement law over the years that I think we have fairly similar thoughts on the world. Not always the same, but fairly similar. So it's a great honor for me to be able to take his slides, which he prepared for this event before he was unable to, before it became impossible for him to participate. He's prepared slides which are certainly much better than anything I would have been able to do. And so I'm going to speak to his slides, not necessarily as if I was Albert, but maybe use them as a trigger for my commentary to think about some of the historic reasons why our processes have led to the sorts of problems which emerged in the horrific events at Grenfell Tower. That will lead us to a break for lunch at around about 12:20. And then after lunch, we look forward to having a team effort from a number of individuals who are on the call. We'll introduce them perhaps after lunch when we get there, who will be able to look more broadly at some of the accountability issues, and we'll then finish up with Roberto Caranta, and then also Brian Richardson, who's a barrister involved in the inquiry. We can then sort of wrap up with some thoughts about how we might try and implement and learn the lessons as quickly as possible, but also as wisely as possible. The program says I should be starting my introduction now, but I think I won't dwell on points any further now. Let me just make sort of the general observation. When I come on to talking to Albert's slides, I will have a lot to say about how the structure of procurement law has been directed to dealing with many problems, which may be significant problems. But for a number of reasons, which we'll come on to explore, there has been a major shortcoming in linking up questions of performance and responsibility in the procurement process with proper procurement procedures. That may be for totally understandable reasons at the time, for historical reasons, when the law and the processes were being put in place, but it has led to a serious disconnect, I think, between propriety. We're often very keen to put in place processes which are defensible and which meet proper standards of probity and propriety. So we're trying to eliminate corruption and so forth, but sometimes often at the dramatic expense of actually ensuring that we are buying the right services from the right people, using structures that actually ensure that responsibilities are properly allocated and properly fulfilled. As I say, I'll come back to a few themes of that probably I'll try to avoid too many war stories, but having been involved in disputes around this stuff for over 30 years, there's inevitably there may be one or two war story elements to this. But the lessons of the last few years is we must learn to do this better. We must move forward. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Richard Craven, Dr. Richard Craven, to set the scene for us with his excellent set of slides. Richard is senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield School of Law, and his research interests concern the regulation of government procurement, including, in particular, compliance, non-commercial procurement objectives, and the role of the private sector in financing and delivering public services. His research starts from what I think might be regarded as a socio-legal perspective, engaging with social research methods and economic sociology. And he's got a lot to cover, and so I'm not going to fill up any more of his time. Richard, take it away.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'm just going to share these slides. Oops. Can everybody see those and hear me okay? Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so just to begin with, thank you very much, Michael and Vanessa, for helping to arrange this, and particularly Michael for stepping in to cover for Albert, who unfortunately couldn't be here. And thanks also to Albert, Jazz, Calra at UCL, and Michael Lewis at Bath, who actually invited me to participate. And I've really learned a lot actually from just preparing this paper. For various reasons, I am going to read a lot of this paper, and mainly that's to sort of try and stick within time, because I've got a lot to say and a lot of slides. So apologies if I have my head down a bit and I'm following a text. So there's the title of my paper. It's about what the Grenfell Tower might tell us about decision-making in local government procurement departments. So as Michael said, this is currently the focus of stage 2 of an ongoing public inquiry. And we don't know to what extent, if at all, procurement can be said to be a contributing factor in what happened. Nevertheless, the information that is coming out about the procurement process for the regeneration of Grenfell suggests it was legally flawed in a number of respects, and it's actually potentially quite revealing. And I say that because much of the decision-making on procurement, as Michael suggested in his introduction, is not shockingly out of the ordinary. And you can, well, we know this because flammable or dangerous cladding found its way into other councils' high-rise buildings. And from a legal point of view, a desire to avoid or circumvent EU procurement law is not unfamiliar, or at least I think practitioners would agree with that, or tend to agree with that. Okay. So here's my presentation today. So I've got far too many slides, as I mentioned, so apologies if I skip through some of them if I'm running short of time. But these are the main sections of the paper. So to begin with, I'm going to just set out some background context of the decision-making environment as I see it. I'm then going to present my theoretical lens. So there's a lot of talk about justice when we think about Grenfell, and I'm going to discuss it in terms of administrative justice. And administrative justice has a particular meaning, understanding in the sort of academic literature. So I'll explain what I mean by that. And then I'm then going to work through what I see as sort of key parts of the decision-making in relation to the Grenfell procurement. And as part of the sort of the analysis, it will involve looking at the justifications that have been provided for decisions. I'm not going to touch on the Hackett review and the working group recommendations, which was Duncan Brock's work, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. But for me, they seem on the face of it to be really, reasonably sensible proposals. But I'm not going to talk about those at all. Okay, so as a starting point, so when I sort of really started to think about this paper, I couldn't help but notice that it was the 50-year anniversary of a really important Milton Friedman article. And that article would play a really significant role in shaping how we think about private corporations. So on the 13th of September 1970, in this article, Friedman argued that company directors, in their capacity as company directors, should not concern themselves with social responsibility. They have one responsibility, and that is to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of the society. both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. Turning to the UK construction industry today, I think we see how this philosophy has been translated into quite an extreme form. So there's a short-termism, as it seems to be apparent, a short-termist approach. So business seemingly incentivized to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, whatever the costs may be. The construction industry has a poor reputation. Amongst other recent scandals, it's a sector that has struggled with anti-competitive practices like bid rigging, blacklisting of trade unionists, and modern slavery issues. It's also noteworthy that at the time of the Grenfell procurement, the sector was still enduring the sort of post-financial crisis recession. So firms were operating under stress. The London Borough of Kensington is certainly not a profit-seeking corporation. However, since the 1970s, in different ways, there have been efforts to model management in the public sector, including local authorities, on management practices and techniques found in private sector management. So Christopher Hood has called this the new public management, but you might have come across it as sort of managerialism. And then, perhaps unsurprisingly then, local authorities, like private corporations in a way, they have a department dedicated, often they have a department dedicated to procurement, and that department in local government feels, or is, very much a commercial environment. So this is a quote from an interview I carried out with a procurement manager in local government. So this is from past research. And you can see there that in terms of the job, it's primarily about getting what you require for the lowest price possible. And departmental performance is often measured via cost savings, because this is something we can count. In terms of context, local government austerity, especially since 2010, should also be mentioned. According to the National Audit Office, from sort of 2010 to 11, up until 17, 18, funding from central government for local government fell from around sort of just below 50%. So though Kensington and Chelsea is an affluent London borough, austerity is so prominent across local government that a doing more with less attitude is a common mindset. Okay, so turning then more to the sort of specific decision-making environment, I think there's a lot of law and legal rules governing decision-making. And much of this actually comes from the EU, and it's quite a prescriptive nature. However, these legal rules are the product of political compromise or sort of intergovernmental negotiations, and are littered with legal grey areas, so legal ambiguity. So in reality, despite all the legal rules, procurement managers who must interpret it and apply the law in practice actually enjoy significant discretion in their decision-making. And this discretion is strong, or at least it's perceived to be strong, because ambiguity combines with a weak system of enforcement. So the regulatory system primarily depends on litigation by disgruntled bidders, and it's often not in a bidder's interest to make a fuss. So in studying the decision-making environment, we can't therefore, I don't think, study decision-making as a matter of compliance or non-compliance, which is how I've approached it in the past. We need to gain an understanding of how competing and complementary normative and ethical positions are sort of reconciled in this environment. So how do procurement managers navigate what Julia Black has called the battle of the norms? And I've referred to it here as a sort of dissonance in this decision-making environment. So turning then to the theoretical framework, administrative justice. So this potentially helps us here. It's a much contested concept, and there are lots of different definitions of administrative justice, but I'm going to use the one that's been put forward by Jerry Mashaw in 1983. So for Mashaw, and then later Michael Adler, Administrative justice is not about the decisions of the courts or tribunals or even public inquiries. With administrative justice, we're interested in the day-to-day legal decision-making that takes place across public authorities. So what you might call the living law. So how do administrative actors put flesh on the bones of discretionary rules or sort of the legislative skeleton that's there? What is justice for these decision makers? And that really, for these scholars, essentially what that means is what justifications do they rely on to defend the outcomes of their decisions? Okay, so Mashaw and Adler, they identify, based on sort of criticisms and justifications that are put forward by individual administrative actors, they describe a limited plurality of decision-making models. These coexist in different environments in a state of tension, and each of these models provide a legitimate basis for a decision. So, for example, bureaucratic justice, I followed the rules. But I'm going to have to skip over a lot of the theory due to the time available, but basically Mashaw and Adler explain how criticism and justifications tell us something about the trade-offs made between different underlying normative conceptions about the way things are being done, about conventional behavior. So an understanding of this might help us make arguments about the need for different sets of trade-offs. Right, turning to the procurement then. To make sense of the criticisms and justifications, it's necessary to separate out the different events in the lead up to this procurement and during this procurement. So firstly, there's the procurement of Kensington Academy and Leisure Centre, so CALC, by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. This procurement doesn't seem to raise any legal issues, any real legal issues. And it's notable, though, that the Grenfell Action Group was established in 2011 to campaign against this project. The second part of the second way I'm dividing up this discussion is the actual Grenfell regeneration, which is carried out by a tenant management organisation in Kensington and Chelsea. So the tenant management organisation, and I might just refer to that as the TMO going forward, has been set up under statute to manage and maintain Kensington and Chelsea's housing stock, so around 9,760 properties. It's a separate, supposedly arm's length company. There are signs, however, that the TMO depended on Kensington and Chelsea. As the TMO depended on Kensington and Chelsea for funding, it was heavily influenced by the local authority, and that's something the Inquirer are looking into. But the TMO on paper, at least, it's not some disconnected, greedy corporate landlord. It's not for profit, and the majority of its board members must be residents or tenants. So we're looking at those two procurement exercises, but this second procurement, there is an overdue, and it's best to consider that procurement in two parts as well. So the Grenfell procurement by the TMO is governed by EU law, and it's necessary to consider it in two parts. So pre-procurement, which is before an advert or a notice is placed in the EU's official journal, which sort of triggers, is this sort of the official launch of the procurement process. And then post-OJU, post start of the procurement, so after the OJU notice, when the competition is formally underway. So Grenfell pre-OJU, and just thinking about, I mean, this is a statement about the purposes of the project earlier on, and I just thought I'd flag it because I think there are sort of social and public values involved here, and actually in the early stages, I think they are quite pronounced, and they crop up throughout the procurement, these public values and these social values. But as the procurement wears on, they become overshadowed by the need to meet the project budget. Okay, so turning to Grenfell then, pre-procurement, the contractor, Ledbetter, wins the CALC project in April 2012. It's a major contract, as you can see there, 57.8 million design and build contract, and it's awarded via a framework agreement under EU procurement rules. So there is a competition for this contract. Soon after, the local authority gives the go-ahead for the Grenfell regeneration. So the TMO has responsibility for that procurement, so the Grenfell regeneration. Legally, the TMO is satisfied it can use Leadbitter as their scope to do so under the calc notice. So they think there's scope to do this under the calc notice, so they can sort of use Leadbitter. They also want to use the calc design team, but there's a risk here that it might need to go through another tender process governed by the EU procurement rules. Apparently, to avoid that, so to avoid this regulated competitive process, the TMO caps the fee payable at an amount under the EU thresholds. So it decides it won't pay more than £174,000 for the design for the Grenfell regeneration. As if it were to do so, EU law would be fully. Okay, so the justification for the need to circumvent the legal rules is that it's the commercially sensible thing to do. The legal rules are arguably in conflict with commercially sensible behavior for the TMO. The TMO has just procured a major project via compliant EU procurement, and as the projects are related, it makes sense to use the same team for this procurement, e.g. They are familiar with the site, etc. So it seems for them, it makes commercial sense to use the same design team. And this approach, they say, saves them money and it saves time. It causes those who live in the tower and roundabouts the least disruption. So here you can see efficiency and what's seen as an efficient interpretation of the legal rules. It dominates. And that's a fairly sort of familiar critique of the procurement rules, that the procurement rules are often criticized for being bureaucratic or inefficient. And I've criticized the rules on that basis. But what criticism does this generate? And this is from the inquiry. Well, the criticism is, I'm not going to read all that because I haven't got time, but the criticism is essentially that the failure to hold an open, transparent, fair competition means that the TMO uses an unsuitable design team and one that lacked the necessary experience. That's disputed, but that's the argument there, that you've prioritized efficiency over public values like transparency and fairness, and for that reason, this is a contributing factor. Moving on then. Eventually, Leadbitter, the contractor, they fall out of favor, it seems, with the local authority in delivering the calc procurement. They're not getting along, and Leadbitter are considered to be too expensive. So there are suggestions that the local authority leans on Artelia, so they're the consultants involved, and the TMO to have Leadbitter removed. So there's a suggestion of political interference there that's being looked at. This time, there is going to be a competitive process. The benefits of the competitive process are sort of apparent to the TMO. They sort of coincide with a desire to get as good a deal as possible for the TMO. And they decide to go through an OJU process. And legal risk is also a factor here, as they're worried that Leadbitter might challenge. So moving on, the procurement process proceeds. And in 2013, the TMO invites final tenders. So final bids from three bidders. And this is against a very detailed specification that's been drawn up by primarily been drawn up by Studio E, who was sort of selected with suspect experience. And it's argued by Ryden that because the specification was so detailed that he sort of concluded from that there wasn't much money to go around and they didn't need to do any further work on the local authorities, the TMO's requirements. Anyway, so there is a tendering invite, best and final offers. The process is made with emphasis on quality over price, and Ryden scores the highest in all categories, and Ryden wins comprehensively. It's got the lowest price, and according to the assessment that's made, it's delivering the best quality. The problem is that the TMO doesn't seem to have the budget for the project. it argues differently, and it did raise the budget a couple of points later on. What this means is that the TMO enters into negotiations with Ryden prior to the award, so without giving other bidders the same opportunity. And this is legally problematic. The procurement rules are based on principles of transparency and equal treatment, and Ryden is having secret discussions with its preferred bidder. What's the justification that's provided for this? Well, again, it's pragmatic, it's commercial. Ryden has won resoundingly, so all attention is on them. The TMO wants to make an award, but to do that, it needs to get an above budget award signed off by the powers that be. So the only way to do this is to assure its board that the winning bidder is aware or accepts that the price will come down. And there are provisions in the contract anyway for value engineering, so they can say, well, this is going to happen anyway, whoever wins. So it is pragmatic. Problem then, the criticism that comes following this. Well, it's a breach of the law. Well, it seems to be suggested by in the public inquiry that this is a breach of the law. And again, it's not consistent with public values. Again, it's not consistent with values such as fairness and transparency. And then moving on to really the third main point that I wanted to consider, and the other issue that crops up, is to do with the relationships between key figures. So these are relationships between key individuals in Ryden and individuals at the TMO. So for example, we've got directors there at the TMOs, Peter Madison, Sasha Jevons, who were really, essentially wined and dined by Ryden at these housing events over the years, and they had a relationship, although according to those involved, it wasn't a friendship, but it was a relationship, and they knew each other well, and they'd worked with each other in the past. So thinking of that in terms of justifications, criticisms and justifications, well, the issue clearly is that these relationships might influence the decisions. Cronyism. The justification, though, again, it shows the difficult sort of trade-off and balance that must be struck, is it's commercial again. So these are complex contracts and they depend on good working relationships, and this is commercial behavior. And where are we going to draw the line? So just some concluding comments, having worked through all that. So I think the main point, I think for me and in my work, has been sort of looking at the public economy and looking at these trade-offs, these sort of well-recognized trade-offs between, say, well, in economics, it's between efficiency and equity, or between economics and sociology, it's between sort of commercial value and public values. And these trade-offs are going on here. And I think the obvious reaction is that we need more legal rules, or we need more professionalization. But I think what I find striking is just this sort of the attitude to the legal rules, and that actually we need to think of a way, we need some way of sort of generating more appreciation of the law. And I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. There we are. I found my unmute. The failure to find the unmute button never gets old, does it? I'm struck, Richard, that by your remarks, that tragically a lot of what you're saying, you harks back to papers you did 10 years ago about compliance in the industry, and about how the PFI industry, as it then was sort of interpreting the law around what it thought was commercially sensible, and if the law wasn't commercially sensible, then it couldn't really be the law, could it? Or it has always been an oddity of this area of the law that the industry but both sides of the equation, both purchasers and sellers have tended to take a rather odd view of lawfulness. Judy, you have a question, but you're on mute. Yeah,
I'm off mute. Thank you very much. I liked the way that you kicked off with Friedman. It's obviously it's a very influential idea and one that has created problems throughout the sectors of the economy. But the theoretical position that Friedman is coming from is that the market, it's sort of the Coase theorem taken to its natural conclusion, that is that if you are a market operator, the end user or the consumer or the client will reject goods and services of lesser value. And so if you are producing something that is dangerous or bad or not meeting people's requirements, eventually you'll go to the wall anyway. And so the market will regulate. And if you are producing shampoo, this kind of works. But it doesn't work if you're producing drugs. It doesn't work if you're producing vaccines, as they found out with the polio situation. And it doesn't work if you're producing buildings because of the sunk costs. So I'm interested as to whether you think that, because what you really put there is you're setting the stage for the market, the ideology of the market, of the free market, to be applied to building procurement. And I wonder if you have a point of view as to whether the industry as a whole, clients or operators or contractors, have ever really unpicked this market theology, this sort of Friedman theology, and rejected it, whether at the highest levels of procurement, and I'm thinking government, and the big trusts and everything, whether this is really understood that the market cannot operate in this manner in this sector, or whether we've all just accepted this too much. How do you see the tensions between that, or do you think it's just people just assume it to be valid?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. I think no. The reason, actually, I cut a lot out there. I was going to talk about the Friedman point a bit longer because I think in recent times there's such a riot. Working in a law school now, I'm not a company lawyer. I don't teach company law, but I have colleagues, and it's clear, I think, and I was going to sort of link to sort of arguments for sort of stakeholder capitalism and the need to sort of reorientate the corporation. Yeah, so I didn't want to actually be too critical of Milton Friedman, because I think if you read him closely, you can. I know he has a sort of bad name. It's not, but in some.
If you read him closely, it makes sense, and
it makes sense.
And in the period that he is writing, where that he's making that observation and that call, if you like, the corporation is bound. This, and particularly in the UK and in the US, antitrust legislation and state-sponsored, we'll call it, it's a little bit like state-sponsored capitalism, we could get into definitions or whatever, have actually really bound the corporation at that point. It is very difficult to operate in many markets because there is not too much regulation. That's not it. There is no market. There is market failure because there hasn't been investment in a lot of places. And so really what Friedman's argument is investment. What his monetary theory and everything is trying to foster investment. The idea is, with the right monetary policy and a free market, transactions will improve and you'll get growth. That's, and the growth will be safe because the market will self-regulate. And in the period that he's going through the 60s, it is the case that things have been hidebound for years. Yeah,
and it just seems like post-financial crisis, particularly in academia. So I'm, that's where I'm coming from, who I work with, these sort of the corporate law is, I can see that there is so much interest from sort of, serious academics now into sort of what the corporation should be about, and sort of stakeholder capitalism, what that means. And it seems like the whole debate has sort of shifted, particularly in recent years. But whether that's making its way into sort of policy debates, and there's an appreciation there, I'm not so sure. I don't really see it at all.
Yeah, but more discussion for another day. Thank you for.
Yeah.
Adrian, you had a question.
Yeah, just coming off mute there. Richard, thank you for a very, very interesting paper. And I'm counsel, one of the many counsel appearing at public inquiry. So it's very interesting to see the analysis from outside of what's taking place at the inquiry. But I didn't want to ask you about that. The elephant in the room, as you referred to in this procurement process, was the fact that, as at the relevant date, the UK was, of course, a full member of the EU, and therefore subject to the full gamut of the EU's procurement processes. And we have now left and are transitioning. And clearly, amongst those who've been enthusiastic for our departure, deregulation, and standing up to the courts, particularly European courts, but to some extent UK courts as well, are quite important objectives. And I'm just wondering how you think the procurement landscape, which you have described, is going to change in the light of the UK's departure from the EU, and in the light of those sort of policy objectives.
Yes, that's really interesting. So there'll be lots of view. I'm sure Michael also has a view on this. But, I mean, the starting point is it's sort of early stages. So I think in the election campaign, Boris Johnson said that we are going to, so in 2019 election, Boris Johnson said we are going to reform the procurement rules by January 2021. We're going to make them simpler and less bureaucratic, and we'll be able to help British companies much more easily and pursue under these procurement rules, which the EU procurement rules are stopping us from doing. I don't know, I think that's possibly likely to be delayed now, given the year we've had. But I don't know. So I think, the driving force, so the criticism, I think of many governments has been that the EU rule, and you can see this in practice, is that the EU rules often stand in the way of sort of commercially sensible behaviour, and they are bureaucratic, and that's the sort of message that goes around. And I think that's the sort of Dominic Cummings sort of critique of the sort of procurement rules. But then in sort of recent times, I think where we've seen, I think the Good Law Project are sort of pursuing a claim in court to do with COVID-related medical supplies that have been awarded sort of non-transparently, and there was the Brexit ferries saga where which was a bit of a chaos and ended up in litigation. So I don't know whether that would sort of convince them otherwise. That these sort of disasters that we've had, procurement disasters that we're having recently, might sort of, make them appreciate that there is some good in actually a fairly strong legal framework. But that's not to say that the EU does it in the best way possible. I think I could, I'm quite critical of the EU's approach. I think what my point there in the talk was actually, I think a lot of the problem with the EU is that, or even, with any government, is that it sees a problem and it thinks, oh, we need a legal rule to respond to that because we need to remove that discretion. But actually legal, it's not a sort of, having a legal rule doesn't mean you sort of lose the discretion, because language is not precise and you sort of just open up another area of discretion. And so I think legal rules aren't necessarily the answer. So I think that the EU system does need a rethink, but whether the UK government are going to do that and put in place the best possible sort of regulatory system is sort of remains to be seen. It's sort of a muddled answer to your question, but I'm sure Michael actually has
I have one or two thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I may share. Before I come into that, there's another question which perhaps sort of ties in with Adrian's question from Cheney Hodgetts. Maybe I can just read it out. How, if at all, do you think the legal procurement processes can be adjusted to take into account the human factors in these processes and go even a small way to mitigate some of the factors which your paper describes? So I suppose that's I suppose, Richard, the premise of that question is, if the government does decide to do something, how would you, do you have any short prescriptions as to how to take account of those human factors in the process?
No, well, the thing is, I sort of went over this, and I was hoping to be really critical of the TMO, and then I sort of saw the TMO, and it's, it's sort of obviously not for profit, and it has sort of representation. I don't know what sort of, I haven't sort of looked in detail at the actual representation, but it has sort of tenants and residents on board, and you think, oh, that's the sort of thing I would tend to sort of argue for. And I think Jazz actually is going to get in. I've sort of scanned through Jazz's sort of slides, and I think he might get into this. And I think there's an effort with sort of social value to have sort of more sort of consultation and more participation in decision making. So that could be the way. But again, it sort of conflicts with the sort of the pragmatic commercial sort of get the deal done, get it done cheap, as in a way that's sort of cost efficient.
Yep. Okay. Shall we move on? Shall I move on to me, or rather me standing in for Albert? Now, owing to my technical incompetence or something, I'm not quite sure why, I'm going to have to do the old school thing and ask Judy to manipulate my slides while I speak. I apologize. So I'm going to have to, I'm not quite sure how I've managed to do this. I should say, sorry. That's brilliant. Thank you. That's brilliant. I should say Albert Sanchez-Grell is an old friend and colleague in the procurement law community. He's Professor of Economic Law and co-director of the Centre for Global Law and Innovation at the University of Bristol Law School, specialises in UK economic law and particularly competition and procurement law, researching a number of different areas. He's a member of the European Commission Stakeholder Expert Group on Public Procurement. And for many of us, his blog, How to Crack a Nut, has been our daily wake-up call on what's been going on in public procurement for many years. He's been an avid blogger on and keeping us all up to speed on what's been going on and how things are developing. So it's a pity that we don't have his. You'll have to put up with my second best. As I say, I'm going to react to his thoughts rather than necessarily just repeat them, because I couldn't. So if we, Judy, can we turn to the next slide? So I think I will try and do something along the lines of what Albert had in mind, but rather than just track through what's come out of phase 2 of the inquiries so far, I'm not going to try and preempt any of the judgments. I'm just going to note what Albert has done in this slideshow is he's put on a series of slides some behaviours which one can note from the evidence so far. Obviously, it'll be for the inquiry to decide as to which was more important and so on and so forth. And I'm going to perhaps try and generalize from that, and then come to the end and draw some more general, make some more generalized suggestions about what the problem is with procurement law in this area. We'll see how that goes within the time. But the core of this is a battle between procurement law and contract management. And to look at whether or not what Albert's referred to as the atomized, contractualized governance could ever work. But before even we get into that, I think it is important just to notice on that front page the division between procurement and contract management. There is a, I will keep coming back to this, and I apologize that a certain amount of this is historical, but I'm probably senior bod here in the procurement law community, so I may indulge myself a little bit to talk about the history, because it is sometimes worth thinking a bit about the history here. We did once have our own procurement law. We got rid of it when we joined the EU, and we started again from scratch with the EU's procurement law. For internal constitutional reasons, with the way the EU law works, EU law has not engaged meaningfully until very recently with harmonization of contract law. There are reasons. They may be problematic in terms of the outcomes, but there are good constitutional reasons why it has not been sensible or practical for EU law to really get into contract management issues. EU procurement law has been focused on primarily on questions about discrimination between bids between member states, because it has seen the primary driver as creating and maintaining the internal market and preventing barriers to that. And that is now a broader goal, which we will not shed on. We will not shed when we actually functionally leave the EU at the end of this year. And I'll talk a bit about it at the end, because our procurement law will still be emphatically a trade-based law. That is the basis constitutionally upon which our procurement law is based and will be based. Now, it happens to be incidentally true that the sorts of things which procurement law drives, EU procurement law drives at around transparency and equal treatment, are also the sorts of goals which can address questions of probity. So generally speaking, if you are concerned with questions of corruption, as procurement law historically has been over many hundreds of years, the sorts of nefarious conduct which might lead you to preferring someone because they're French or British or Irish will be similar to the sorts of measures you might take to prevent you from favoring someone because they are related to your uncle or because they've given you a large bucket of cash. And the law functions at that pre-contract phase. But there has been little or no linkage until there are some exceptions to this, which I may not get time to get into in the most recent round of legislative amendments, but there is basically no linkage between the procurement process and the contract output within the EU law structure. Now, that's not to say that member states couldn't or shouldn't have done their own better job of doing it, but of course, it was philosophically unacceptable for UK governments over many years to do anything that smelt of gold plating EU law. And so EU law did what it did, and it was not possible for UK governments for many years to go beyond what UK law already provided for. So if it couldn't be done at EU level, it couldn't be done at all. For political reasons, because that would smell of gold plating. And so there's a historical reason why we've sort of ended up with the law we have. I will come back to this thought. Can we look at the next slide, Judy? And historically, it's worth looking at two contrasting models. We've got the second, if we could go to the next one. We're looking at two contrasting models of service and construction delivery within government, within local government or central government. It's much the same. The stylized in-house model, which Albert has used, is quite right, used the Catalan Castell as a stylized metaphor for. I think he's already demonstrated my rivalry with him, because I think that was the rival team to the team my son used to compete with when he lived in Barcelona. So I think I used to hurl insults at that red-shirted bunch, because my son was always wearing blue. He was from the next door town square. Anyway, enough of that. The stylized in-house model was the model that those of us who were around to remember was very much the model of the 70s and 80s. It was the model that was being broken down by government in the 80s. It was around, and the sorts of things that we're talking about in the context of Grenfell would have involved what we then had direct labor organizations and direct service organizations. These were substantial organizations that did work. They carried out large works and large large building services contracts. They typically would have been the ones doing the sort of work which we're talking about here. They might or might not have been. I mean, but they were large institutions, and one of the goals of procurement, domestic procurement law in the 80s, was to break these down by compulsory competitive tendering and other initiatives. And there were, of course, a number of economic and political reasons for that. It may be that not all of the DLOs and DSOs were the most effective and efficient bodies. But it's also true, of course, that DLOs and DSOs were politically significant entities. They represented a body of resistance to a political and economic model which government was trying to promote in the 1980s. So there were a range of reasons, whether good or bad, for breaking down that in-house model. Perhaps it was never always entirely in-house, because of course even then, large construction would always have had to have gone out to tender to construction companies, but that model existed. The other angle, of course, is the extreme outsourcing. And Judy, can we look at the next slide? The extreme outsourcing model is, of course, the contrast. We may not have reached the extreme, as maybe that outsourcing could always go further, but it's certainly where the Grenfell Tower model is a heavily outsourced model, and it represents a destination which we've reached. One of the problems with the there are many problems with the outsourcing model. One of the problems with the outsourcing model is that it necessitates management through contract. Whatever the strengths or weaknesses of the DLO, the direct service organization model used to be, if something was going wrong in a project being done by a direct service organization, you didn't need to go through the contract. The DSO was part of the local authority. If things weren't going right with the DSO, someone would come down and say, right, you need to do this better. We need to change things. You could change things as went along. You could manage internally as part of an internal structure. To use the language of EU procurement law, you manage the DSO as if it was one of your own departments, because it was. Through the outsourcing model, management has to be done through contract. And the difficulty with that, of course, is you negotiate the contract, you set up the contract, you have contractual means of management, which maybe have some means of effect. The architect or the engineer or the surveyor or the building surveyor may have some means of control, but these are largely contractual means of, they're largely contractual levers. And if you haven't negotiated the right levers to start with, this can be problematic. This is made more problematic by the fact that we have loaded into our procurement procedures an enormous amount of content. And I don't think anyone has really, the government hasn't really noticed what it has managed to do to procurement over the last 10 or 15 years. 20, 25 years ago, when EU procurement law was just getting into its stride, procurement law was about a balancing of price against quality, and we used to talk about value. Price against quality was an evaluation which you could do. It was very much looking at direct quality matters. Now, there was an immediate problem. Quality often did not sufficiently look at life cycle costing. Roberto's just been involved in a book on this topic, and it was a major shortfall in the way we looked at value, that we often failed to look at life cycle costing enough. It wasn't that the law stopped us from doing it, we just often didn't do it enough. I, sometimes there was a pretense that it couldn't be done because the law prevented it. It didn't. It just we did not sufficiently mandate it as a matter of process. Of course, what has happened in recent years is we've had a series of contrasting pressures come into the process. On the one hand, as Richard has already identified, we have had a mindset of austerity, which has, I'll use a loaded word. I'll say infected, if it's an unloaded, which has infected everything. It is impossible to get away from the mindset of austerity in government projects, even if it's not explicitly stated. And we've loaded onto it lots of other things, lots of other goods. We've loaded onto it environmental goods, short-term environmental goods, broader societal environmental goods. We've loaded onto it social goods, both narrow in terms of local goods, localism, but also broader social goods. These may all be good things, but politicians, I think, have been all too easy, and politicians and maybe sometimes officials have been all too keen to load onto procurement their anxieties about environment, social, and so forth, without actually thinking about, firstly, what that actually means in terms of deliverability, but also what it means for the procurement itself. What do I mean about deliverability? Well, it's all very well to say, I want a greener outcome and so on and so forth. Well, how do you actually expect that to be done? Is it realistic? I want this particular social outcome or that particular social outcome. That may be a good thing. But how do you actually expect it to be delivered in a contractual model? How are you going to evaluate this? How are you going to evaluate this in an area where you still have a contractual competition? You're dealing with this in the process of competition. And so if I say, well, I want you to meet social goal X, Y, and Z, all the bidders will do the best they possibly can to meet social goal X, Y, and Z. Whatever goal you set, they will do their best to meet it. But two important things need to be borne in mind. Firstly, unless you have a very good way of measuring social goal X, Y, and Z, there is an all too easy default that you will end up simply demanding the compliance with a set of questions which amount to a jolly good essay writing contest. And I'm going to stick my neck out and say most procurements I'm involved in involving social and environmental criteria usually involve increasingly a very large amount of the marks for deciding who's going to win the procurement being nothing to do with whether or not the contract is or is not good, but whether or not it can write good essays about social and environmental governance and compliance. If you haven't got a decent method of metrics about compliance, quality, you're not actually policing the outcomes at the beginning. And as I say, it's very easy to say, I want this compliance goal to be met, and I want this, that, and so on and so forth, if you don't have a means of actually policing it. Secondly, if you set goals X, Y, and Z, then goals A, B, and C will not be dealt with. Whatever you don't set is not going to be dealt with. If it's not on the question, we've all done exams. None of us revise for the exam that we know isn't on the syllabus. At least I hope we don't. And trying to make sure we deal with the broader questions is very difficult. And the real issue here, of course, is about contract responsibility and having sensible means of contract responsibilities, and ensuring that there is proper ongoing means of delivering that. Now, this, of course, quite separate from procurement law, has been an ongoing issue in the construction industry, again, since the 80s. In the 1980s, the construction industry was thought to be conflict bound, and one of the major problems was that all bids were price driven, and I will get there, Judy. I'm going to get there. I'm going to rattle through the slides. Don't worry. All the construction industry was thought to be conflict bound, and what we needed was to find a new model to avoid conflict, because conflict was creating litigation. It was creating low price, low quality, and litigation. And so what the construction industry, and I must acknowledge my colleagues in the Centre of Construction Law at King's who've been working on this valiantly for 20 years, and they're still very much involved in it in the context of Grenfell. trying to work on better relationships. And better relationships, I'm sure, do create better construction and better relationships on site. But of course, collaboration can itself sometimes be insidious. There are times when sometimes you just shouldn't be collaborating. You should be saying, no, do this and do that. And there is a danger sometimes that the collaborative atmosphere, again, can undermine what sometimes needs to be uncollaborative. And just saying to someone you're not being collaborative sometimes can be the antithesis of getting the right outcome. So we've created historically a lot of problems. So Judy, let's rattle through Albert's slides on the inquiry. He says a quick look at some of the evidence, including perhaps some simplifications. Let's look at the next slide. And Albert has picked up a number of problems, some of which have already been touched on. Firstly, the complexity of management, of governance here. Now, I'm not going to preempt what the final conclusions are on all of this. This is probably not an untypical network. I don't think any of us involved in these fields, well, I'd be interested what people think on here, but I would imagine that people don't think that this is untypically complex. It's a fairly typical network, but you only have to look at it. If you ask yourself the question, how is one entity going to deal with the next? Not straightforward. It is a it's not a straight. This is the natural product of where we've ended up. It's the natural product of the outsourcing philosophy. I'm not going to say today that this is what's caused the disaster, but it is certainly raises questions as to whether it is the structure that we would think was ideal to getting the right performance outcomes. Let's move to the next one. Subcontracting processes have certainly as to use Albert's phrase, magnify the atomization of the contractualized governance structure. What do we mean by that? We've broken up the governance structure into lots of little levers, and the more you break down the subcontracting, the more you change the or you render unclear the proper management structures. Now, an economist might say, well, that's what are you complaining about? I mean, it's the old sort of story about, you know, I don't know, no one knows how to make a lead pencil, because to make a lead pencil involves so many different people from different places, and that's fine. The efficient production of a lead pencil involves lots of different providers doing the best they can, and it all comes together in a beautiful lead pencil at the end of it. Well, that may be right, but of course, if you're producing lead, and picking up Judy's point earlier, if you're making lead pencils, if they break, you just don't buy any more lead pencils from that supplier. You don't need to worry about the management of the lead pencil production, because if that company can't produce a decent lead pencil, that's the end of it. They're no longer in business. But the internal management of the processes which lead to the delivery of maintenance to large housing projects is not as simple as that, and it does not have the same direct economic tools to driving correct outcomes. And so it is much harder to manage if we don't have, if this is, to use Albert's phrase, atomized. Moving on to the next slide. I'm going to let that slide speak for itself, lest it be thought that I've descended into the arena. But I'm certainly not going to. I think I've blogged on at least about a couple of these aspects of the Grenfell inquiry on my blog. There is certainly the possibility of these things happening in any public procurement. And rather than speak specifically about Grenfell, I'm just going to observe that these are common recurring problems in public procurement. One of the major problems, I would say, in public procurement in the United Kingdom for the last 30 years has been the rather insufferable smugness of our political structures, which have tended to say that procurement law problems are not for us. I'm going to be rude about Italians because Roberta will stand up. They will say the smugness goes as far as saying it's not our problem if it's a problem for Italians, but not for us. We shouldn't have to worry about that. These things don't happen here. I mean, it just isn't true. We may do things differently. We may find different ways of delivering these particular evils, but we certainly do manage to deliver them. And on the following slides, Albert has drawn from the ongoing evidence at least some suggestions as to from the evidence so far, which suggests that these may be problems in Grenfell. So if the next slide, Judy, would be political interference, an unwillingness to face market facts. I'm not going to read it out, but there we are. There's a suggestion from Albert there. Deliberate bypassing of the rules. This is the next slide, Judy. I've blogged on this if you want. Mostly procurement. If you Google mostly procurement and my name Bowsher, you'll find my blog, and I've blogged on this particular point. There's an example there. Illegal bending of the procurement rules is the next blog. Next is the next slide. Again, Albert's given us an instance there. And astonishing is a good word from his slide there. He's then given us an instance of shirking an excessive reasonable reliance is the next slide. Again, we'll have to see how this turns out in the final version, but it doesn't seem an unreasonable interim judgment. Is leaving you all time to read this, so I don't just read out Albert's language. Excessive self-interestedness, he's given us an example. Is his last, is the next slide, there we are. I think that Albert's done a good job there of showing that at least so far, this inquiry has brought forward some pretty decent evidence that these may be problems on Grenfell, and as I've suggested, I hope Grenfell is unlikely to be an exception. So some thoughts is the next slide. Maybe we should just move on to the next slide, Judy, as my time runs down. Grenfell is not an exception. I certainly would agree with that. And I think I would emphasize the second point, the weakness of the public buyer and its ability to function and the integration function. Maybe we should go on. Can we go on to Albert's next slide? That's, I'm not disagreeing with that. That's Albert's conclusion. It uses words which I don't necessarily normally all use. That's the way Albert puts the conclusion. I'm going to give you some on the next one, give you my own conclusions in a slightly different way. Let's leave that up so you can compare. The next slide says, can it be fixed? Let's leave up Albert's conclusions. And let me make a few observations from a slightly different perspective. And the perspective I'm going to adopt is really picking up the question from, I think, Adrian put to Richard about, well, what will happen next and how have we got here? So historically, I've said quite a bit about how we've ended up with the law we have. And Richard's absolutely right to say that there has been a major problem. It goes right back to the beginning of the 1990s when the EU measures were first put into law in the UK. For reasons which I won't go into now, it was decided that the only regulatory structure in public procurement would be private litigation. And the only people who had direct means of claim were those who were disappointed bidders, people who would have wanted to win the contract and were denied the right to do so. So there is no automatic right of challenge by anyone wanting to raise a point that, you know, challenging the procurement because it doesn't adequately deal with safety, or it doesn't adequately deal with social goals, or it doesn't adequately deal with environmental goals. Now, this is becoming more a hot topic, and will be a hot topic in the coming months as to who has standing to challenge what in public procurement. But I think you can assume that the law remains very narrowly based in the means by which litigation can actually challenge any outcome. Inevitably, challengers are focused on their own interests, and their own interests are winning contracts. And so they will only challenge things which have affected their ability to win contracts. And they are also further limited because the law has imposed a very strict time limit on them. Adrian and I were involved in a matter involving exactly this question, but the strictness of those time limits means that the only things which are likely ever to be challenged, by and large, will be the outcome of the final award decision. By and large, if you look at procurement case law, most of it concerns the actual decision as to whether or not A or B wins. The processes that led to it are hardly ever challenged in domestic law. That's not quite true, but because unless there is something so structurally wrong that one bidder or another is denied the ability of competing fairly, it will not be in its interests to make a challenge. It will simply say, well, this may be a load of rubbish, but it's a load of rubbish. I want to win. I'll shrug my shoulders and do the best I can. It maybe I think this is a rubbish exam, but I'm going to do my best and win and still get the top mark in the exam. There is virtually no interest in anyone challenging. And for historic reasons, I mean, I personally think it was probably because partly to do with the smugness factor that back in the 90s, which I've already referred to, and partly because central government didn't want anyone poking its nose in its power to hand out contracts, there was no regulatory structure put in place to look at public procurement. It was a deliberate choice to insulate purchasing from any ongoing regulation. Only in the last 18 months or so, now that we're faced with the prospect of actually having to put in place our own procurement law, is there finally some recognition that we might have to do something differently. I'll put up a paper on my blog, or I'll repeat in the next day or two on my blog a paper which I did in February in the US, which refers to some of the recent think tank material often from fairly right-wing think tanks, which is beginning to come to terms with this. The reality is that our procurement law is not going to change very much. A week or so ago, we signed up again to the WTO government procurement agreement. Any trade deal we do with anyone will require us to sign up to a procurement law which will look remarkably like EU law. The WTO government procurement agreement, which we've just acceded to, is effectively a simplification of EU procurement law. So by signing up to the WTO, when we talk about WTO rules, that essentially means we're agreeing that our procurement law won't change. Now, we may have more flexibility within WTO than we would within the EU. There are important areas of flexibility, and Richard and I will give you a seminar on another occasion about what the real differences in flex might be between EU and WTO. There's many hours we could take up in that, but the short conclusion of all of that is none of it matters for the purpose of this current discussion. Lots of interesting detail, but no big picture difference. And while we have the structure that we do have, we have created a process within central and local procurement departments that is a mix of two sort of characteristics. either avoidance or defensiveness, or a mixture of both. The avoidance is, this is all a bit of nonsense and I'll do what I can to try and make sure that the law doesn't apply, or that I minimize the extent to which I have to comply with it. Or defensiveness, which is a more recent feature, which is more along the lines of, okay, in the last 10 years, there has suddenly been a rapid increase in the amount of litigation. More and more people are getting caught out for doing things wrong. So what I'm going to do is come up with a really good defensive mechanism. And what that involves is producing a really good sausage machine, which will be totally, it will set some really good essays, and I will be able to defend the operation of the machine. And as long as the machine produces the answer, a bit like that machine in Big with Tom Hanks, you know, the ticket comes out and it says the answer is Richard has won, Michael has lost. As long as the machine cannot be attacked, then I cannot be challenged for having spat out the answer. And no one will be able to look inside the machine. The machine will be sacrosanct, because apart from anything else, by the time anyone wants to come along and look at what happened in the machine, it'll be too late to sue. And I will have a good defensible answer to almost any question of challenge. That, I'm afraid, is the sorry state that we've reached. And until we find a means that breaks that open, that does two things, that breaks open responsibility for the steps within the procurement process and adequately links the procurement process with performance outcomes, we will again and again and again find that this dislocation between the contractual structures and the procurement structures means that things will go wrong in public projects. As you will have gathered, I can go on for a great deal longer than this on this topic, and you've had my views and Albert's synthesized, and I've gone over by 2 minutes, so I should now spank myself as the chair. Anyone got questions before we break for lunch? No one's dared say anything on chat or Q&A while I've been speaking, so you've either given up on me or I've answered all your questions. Which can it possibly be?
There is a
I
question.
have one question.
Okay.
Yes? Question from whom? Sorry, I can't see the question.
So there's one in the Q&A, Michael. Would you say one operational side effect of an atomized, contractualized governance model is to create silos, which could lead to communication barriers in real-world systems of work, such as, for example, construction safety?
It doesn't, it's not that it could, it does, indeed it requires. The way that, I mean, if I look at procurement processes, the way that a procurement process for if a well-run procurement, I'm going to put well-run in inverted commas, but what would be regarded as a well-run process from a compliance perspective will give the tenderers 7% marks for demonstrating construction safety. You know, because they'll have, out of 100%, there'll be price and environment and social, and they all get marks, and construction safety will be X%. And to do that, they will have to demonstrate that they meet these standards and those standards and these standards, and then they'll have to demonstrate that they've meet these safety requirements. And part of the process will be that that answer is marked and evaluated separately from all the other answers. There will be no crossover. A crossover between one and the other will be prohibited. And so if it is very difficult in a modern procurement structure to look at the answer on social value. Okay, let me say something. You know, I can't think what I don't want to be facetious, so because that would be inappropriate. But you know, if the answer on social value, on some aspect of social value is excellent in social value terms, but is a construction safety disaster, the way most procurements are set up, it is impossible for one to have effect on the other, so that the person marking construction safety will have no means, will be positively prohibited from saying, well, I would give you 10 out of 10 for safety, but your answer on social value is a construction safety nightmare because you're allowing 3-year-olds to operate forklift trucks. Sorry, I did get facetious, but you know, that will be positively prohibited. Now that's a silly example, but there are there are many more subtle times when actually that sort of I'll call it joined up thinking, because I can't think of a less hokey term for it. Albert would have the proper word for it. Unatomized is not the right word, but you know, the processes are not working well to achieve that sort of connected thinking. So I haven't really answered the question, but I've used it as a launching point for another rant. Any other questions? I have a question. Sam has a question. Any more questions? No?
Michael, do you mind if I put forward my question?
Yes, sorry, yes.
I'll go after. Cool.
Oh, sorry, Judy.
No.
I'm working with Adrian. I'm one of the QC's instructor on behalf of the families and survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire. My own background, which is slightly relevant to the question, is criminal, working as a regulator with Vanessa Davies, and I do inquiries and inquests. I therefore don't come from a construction background or commercial background. On that basis, you've clearly been paying attention, as has Albert, to the evidence that's being given before the inquiry that seems to say that the tender process was undermined by backroom chats and underhand meetings. Now, this is an ongoing process of evidence that's being given before the inquiry, and there's been no summation of that evidence, but that is what is appears to be coming across as of the moment. My question, therefore, is: does that surprise you that that there may have been something untoward about the negotiations or the tender process between the companies that may be undertaking the work and a TMO? Is that something that you've encountered within the commercial construction sphere before? Is it common? Is it very unusual? It would help, I think, my own understanding to give some reality from the construction and commercial side, procurement side, as to how common these things are perverted, or how common it is for these things to go badly wrong.
Well, like you, Sam, as a barrister, I was when someone asks how common is something, I'm always a bit worried, because as we're the equivalent of professional pathologists, obviously everything we've seen is something that's gone wrong. So there's a danger that I start from a heavily slanted sample. But certainly, let me answer the question. I got into doing public procurement law when I was working in Brussels in the 1980s. I came back to the bar in the 1990s. People laughed at me, how are you going to make a living as doing public procurement law? By the time at the end of the 1990s, I was able to more or less exclusively, increasingly specialize. By the middle of the 1990s, that was all I did. I have been able to make a career out of the carrion of public procurement procedures. There's an awful lot of it. And one of the problems, which, as I mentioned, Richard did a paper, it's a long, long time ago, when actually I think in many ways things were a lot worse at the height of the PFI phase, when the attitude to procurement, questions of probity and propriety were even more casual in the 90s. I think, this may surprise you to say, I think things have got better. I think people are now more focused on this law is serious, things do go wrong, and we do need to come up with proper compliance. There was a period in the 1990s when the attitude was public procurement law was nonsense, it is only for Italians. You know, we don't need that sort of nonsense here, we behave properly. By definition, if I am doing this, it can't be unlawful, was almost the view of legality taken in large sections. I mean, this is amongst, you know, lawyers advising on projects as well, shockingly. So it may surprise you to say, I think actually things have got better, but this is very far from being the worst example of casual, sloppy, inappropriate communications within the various players. Does that answer your question without answering it, Sam?
It does. As someone, as with Adrian, we may be making submissions on these points before the inquiry at some stage. If there is any, if there are any academic studies or analysis of this type of behaviour that might in some way touch on prevalence, it might be useful, because one of the points that we'll be seeking to do in the future is to make submissions on regulatory control of poor behaviour. And your point is not lost on us, which is that obviously we're in a post European stage, and so that might also have some relevance.
Yeah.
But the danger, obviously, from our perspective, is the inquiry will just say, well, this relates to the behaviour of these individuals, rather than it showing that there's a need for stronger regulation in this area, and that might be important for us to be able to say, no, this goes on.
Yep. Well, I'll think about how to help you there.
I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Judy, you had a question. Sorry, we're running.
Yeah,
carry on.
Thank you very much. I understand that what you presented was a fusion of yourself and others. So I hope you don't mind if I ask you directly.
Yeah.
So last week I considered how contracts in quality to some degree a very long time ago. And sort of my basic argument was they worked with a much simpler set of institutions, and where the responsibility for enforcement and for, you know, or the person who had to deal with things when they went wrong was very clearly vested in one owner. And that property owning class was actually quite a small number of people. And it's not that it was risk-free, but it made everything a lot simpler. Mm-hmm. The other thing to bear in mind is the contractor in that old system, the contractor didn't get paid until the work was checked. They just at all. And obviously that's the sort of contracting model that we have today doesn't raise that. But the thing is interesting to note is contractor margins have fallen from about 20% in the mid 19th century to about 1.5% today. So if you're going to enforce safety or procurement or other contractual rules, if you're going to manage through contract and then use a contract to incentivize good performance from a contractor, but give them a margin of 1.5%, they can't absorb that risk. They simply cannot. So there's an argument to say that the goals of financial austerity or financial cost cutting and contract or management by contract are just totally incompatible. Is there any way that, in your opinion, that those financial aspects can be dealt with within procurement law through some kind of posting of a bond, which is what the theory suggests that when contracts are incomplete like this, you post a bond.
Well, I'm sure that people will have a lot of views about whether or not having to post bonds. I mean, you know, if you're a very large contractor, you can post bonds and you can afford it. I'm sure that the construction lobby will make certain that compulsory bonds never happen. Sorry, I'm pouring cold water, but I'm not saying you're wrong.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, no, this is why. Sorry, I agree entirely, which is why I want to actually.
Yeah, because bonds, you know, the point you make about margins, I haven't studied it in the last, but I read, I'm the sad geek who avidly reads Building Magazine every week. So, you know, the levels of margins and bonds are not compatible stories for most parts of the industry. Now, one answer, the pure procurement lawyer might say, oh, well, we've come up with a great solution in the latest directive, because now, it's now in Regulation 57 of our public contracts regulations, you can prevent someone from winning another public contract because of past poor performance. Yeah, well, I mean, that just creates a recipe for more litigation, which obviously I'm not going to discourage. I mean, I think more litigation is a good thing. I mean, you know, I've got a few more years left in me, but it doesn't really answer.
Meanwhile, the actual end product of the first project is
still a disaster. It's still a disaster.
And as we covered last week, demolition is never dealt with. Like that, like as Holly went through last week, actually demolition never happens. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that I'm afraid, I mean, picking up a comment which was just come up on the Q&A, I think the twin problems, that both in terms of probity and in performance, one of the major problems is the gutting, the hollowing out of the regulatory process. When I started out doing this sort of stuff, we had the audit commission that would you know, local authorities were genuinely scared of the audit commission, which I often used to think that local authorities were much better at dealing with probity issues, probably because they were genuinely scared, and the accounting officer of a local authority was genuinely scared of the regulator. Of course, one of the great gifts of the Cameron government was to get rid of the audit commission, to privatize that process. And because the desktop regulator, we were all going to replace the audit commission by spending our weekends poring over local authority accounts and prizing out these probity problems. Yeah, okay. So that's point one on probity. On terms of performance, I think it comes back to building control. This has not been an area of my own specialization. I used to do a lot of building control work once upon a time when I was in the same chambers as Adrian. It was a lot of building control prosecutions. I used to enjoy it a lot. And the impression I have is that once upon a time, building control was quite scary. Yeah, I don't know.
It was.
I leave it to others to judge whether it is now.
Well, that question, I think, has been raised in the Q&A, Michael. What about the role of oversight and enforcement of all of this? At Grenfell, if an external inspector saw the issues with the cladding gap, the works would have been stopped and amended. Yet the deregulators have and will argue against this kind of oversight, which has demonstrable benefits. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Anyone else? I mean, I think a more powerful ongoing regulatory process on performance is what's called for. And you could link that into procurement, and it would link in very well with our new power to debar people from future contracts for poor performance. You know, one of the signals of poor performance would be you repeatedly refuse to comply with the requirement of the statutory regulator, and that would be a real discipline for people whose lifeblood was public contracts. But that's not where we are at the moment. That may be a sensible and viable proposal for legal change to public procurement law. Any other response? I mean, for anyone who has more current day-to-day knowledge of public procurement of building control than I, want to step in on that. Other than that, we're supposed to be back at 12:50, and our lunchtime has now gone down to 11 minutes, Vanessa, and I've allowed it. And this reflects very badly on my chairmanship, and I'm feeling very guilty.
I don't think you should worry too much, Michael, because the discussion has been interesting. I would suggest that we perhaps take a 20-minute break, which will bring us back at 1:10. Is everybody okay with that? Yeah, I think so. Jolly good. So we'll see you all again at 1:10 UK time. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Vanessa, is anything we need to tell people or check that they've had their correct lunch? I think we're okay.
Well, I don't think there's much that we can do about that for
There's
people.
nothing we do. It's one of the joys of Zoom is we don't have to talk about the quality of the food or where the fire exits are.
We don't. We should perhaps let everybody know that we are hoping that we'll finish by about 2:20.
That's the aim. Yes. So, welcome back, everyone. I hope you're adequately refreshed. So we're very lucky to have a really great paper to take us through to the final discussion. This is a team, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce Jaz Kalra, who will then introduce the rest of the team and sort of spell out how and he leave to that team to choreograph the group. This paper really takes on a number of the themes that we've already discussed, but in a much more practical way than I can think of. So I'm looking forward to seeing where this takes us. Jaz is a research fellow in supply chain integration and business models at the Bartlett School. I would say here at UCL, but well, in a sense here at UCL. His research interests are around procurement, complex projects and professional services, researching how organizations set up and orchestrate inter-organizational networks to create and access assets, resources and capabilities. And he uses a variety of qualitative methods such as case research and so forth. This enables him to do all that I'm completely incapable of doing, and actually work out what's going to happen and how to make it better. So I'm looking forward to Jaz and the others in your distinguished team to tell us what we should be doing. Jaz, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for this really good introduction. I couldn't have introduced myself in any other way, or as good as you did. So thank you very much for that. I would like to take this opportunity to, well, let me share my screen first and check before I say anything further. Are you all able to see my screen now? The slides? Great. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to introduce my colleagues and just say that it's such an honor to be a part of this panel and to be able to present our joint work on this interesting and important debate. So my name is Jaz Kalra. As you know, I'm a research fellow in supply chain integration and business models at the Bartlett School of Construction and Project Management, University College London. Michael Lewis, Professor Michael Lewis, who couldn't join us today because of some health issues. He's a professor of operations and supply management at University of Bath School of Management, and he looks at a variety of themes, but his current passion is towards public procurement, complex infrastructure projects, and professional services. Manoush Sarafan, she is a research fellow at University of Bath School of Management and University of Cambridge Judge Business School. And she looks at the behavioral aspects of supply chain management and procurement. And she uses a variety of experimental method to examine the behavior of managers and decision-making in these complex settings. And last but not the least, we have Rahima Silva. She is a research fellow at Bennett Institute of Public Policy at University of Cambridge. And she operates in a really interesting space at the intersection of management, policy, and infrastructure and developmental economics. And she's a qualitative researcher with also a keen interest in behavioral experiments. So I'm just grateful to be in such sort of nice company and be a part of this paper. So what I would like to do is that I would like my slides to work. Okay, so yes. So to start with, what are we talking about today? Essentially, from a procurement practice perspective. In these complex projects, due to division of labor and functional specialization, these complex projects are delivered by a variety of organizations with their own set of niche capabilities. Now, which, in other words, these organizations and their capabilities need to come together to produce these complex collective outcomes. Now, what that means is that then procurement becomes a mechanism for organizing these capabilities and governing these capabilities and driving those behaviors, which means that getting your intentions and objectives right, and then mapping these capabilities and these suppliers and these actors along those intentions and objectives to drive effective procurement, at least in the theory. So truly, what Dame Hackett said in her view is that procurement really sets the tone of how these relationships are going to be managed once the ink on the contract is dry. So the way this procurement is managed is going to drive a lot of outcomes. Having said that, being the organizing mechanism for a range of these capabilities also implies that procurement people are always faced with a problem of buying more than they know, which means they are going to be buying these complex outcomes essentially from these organizations, but they won't always necessarily have the knowledge of what they're buying. So that's something. So our presentation, our paper is organized as, we'll start with saying what happened, or our interpretation of what happened based on the press releases and the information that's out there. Then what was missing from our academic analysis, what we think was missing and what could have gone well, or what could have arguably prevented some of this. And then finally, what next? We will sign off with raising a points for discussion amongst you, and see what you think about them. So what happened? Now we know, and as a range of reviews have highlighted over so many years, and I don't think anyone would disagree on this panel here, is that the construction industry in particular suffers from some really poor industrial norms, which kind of leads to lack of collaborative behavior and contracting, which is a bit more adversarial in nature and a bit more arm's length, and creating scenarios where there is a lot of emphasis on defining the penalties, if you like, for failure, and that kind of leads to a lot of blame game between these parties. Now, and when they do decide to collaborate, they collaborate at the wrong time for the wrong intentions. So what we kind of can, I think, agree on that these norms, these kind of way we do procurement and way these capabilities are organized and way these construction projects are managed have given rise to relationships in this sector which are low on trust and low on collaboration, and ultimately they kind of have a more of a priority on their own profit and value for money, or cost reduction, than some of the other outcomes which you have discussed in your papers. Just building on that, in spite of government trying to kind of bring some social value into this and the other industries through, for example, the Public Services Social Value Act 2012, what happens is that these industrial norms, they do take over. First of all, these regulations are open to interpretation, or they are open to interpretation, and they are kind of worded as it's discretionary, that you might choose to follow them or not, and that kind of leads to a lip service being paid to these regulations than actually being implemented proactively at the start of design of these contracting or RFQs phases. And that sort of, and also in the contract management phase, I mean, that kind of continues, and that was evidenced with some of this, some of the evidence in the inquiry, that their whole focus was on value engineering and cost saving, and safety was kind of put on a back burner when negotiating these contracts or managing these contracts. So that's against that backdrop. What I will do, what we've done is that we have focused on one particular supply chain in that network map that Albert and Michael showed in their slides. And that is kind of driven by some of the findings of the phase 1 inquiry that, of course, there were problems in the range of kind of supply chains within that network, but that refurbishment contract was particularly problematic, and particularly the cladding material being supplied in that refurbishment contract. So we have to, kind of, because that's kind of the focus of the conversation, we decided to focus our analysis on that particular supply chain and use it almost like a case to understand some of the wider problems that were happening in this procurement world. So for this refurbishment contract, RBKC was the building control department, and they had given the responsibility and made effectively the TMO the operational client for this contract. Ryden was the service provider, and Harley Facade was the cladding material supplier. So that's again a very kind of a simplified version of what is essentially a very complex supply chain. Now, what we want to say in this paper is that the incompetency and the incapability of procurement manifested at different levels of the supply chain and over time at different phases of this project. So in procurement, then the management of the project, and then ultimately the management of the built asset itself. And this procurement failures or dysfunctions, they manifest themselves over time and up and down the supply chain. And that's what we are going to talk about today. So if we just focus on this dyad in the supply chain, which is the TMO and Ryden, their relationship, we see that in the procurement phase, it has been claimed by TMO that they were given a lot of misleading information. A lot of misrepresentation was there from Ryden's side to TMO. So they just didn't know what Ryden was saying. So was it CVs which were kind of oversold, or the bid that was inaccurate, or a miscalculation? What we want to say from a procurement perspective that, yes, okay, TMO was let down by that, but as a procurement organization or someone who's handling that procurement, they should have had the capability to be able to understand and examine that misrepresented information rather than just taking that at face value. That was further manifested in the project management phase, when they were essentially sold a substandard material, and they just said, yeah, fine, you know better. Whatever you're saying, yeah, we'll just go with it as long as you're helping us achieve those cost reductions that we have given you the target for. So this kind of, the fact that they did not have the knowledge, but they did not make any effort to gain knowledge of this procurement, kind of manifested in this dyad, and that led to some of the problems that we have been talking about today. On the next level, I mean, if we look at this from Ryden's perspective, we find that they were dependent on, they were not the experts. They did not have the knowledge themselves to check the quality of the material, the work done by Harley Facade, and what that would imply for this refurbishment. They just did not know how to check this work, and they were essentially relying on some of the other actors in the supply chain to be able to check that work for them. So there was again this knowledge gap, this knowledge asymmetry between these two suppliers, and we see that this knowledge asymmetry is not just between what I started by saying, that buying more than you know. It's not just at the client or on the side of that operational client, but it actually cascades down the supply chain as well. What we would also see is that, interestingly, that this was kind of raised by one of the consultants to TMO, that they should probably get a client design advisor who should be able to look at the quality of the work and do the sign off. And here it raises a really interesting point, that in spite of this advice being given, TMO decided not to take it because it would cost them £30,000. So priorities there. So, and they said they were essentially relying on Harley Facade's expertise and Ryden's expertise, that, we have warranties and they are like specialist cladding designers, Harley Facade. They should be able to provide us with the right materials, and everything will be fine. We don't have to do this. But there's something towards the part of the code that I've highlighted, that yes, but you would still need to sign it off, that in the procurement world, no matter how do you draft a contract, and you would try to assign and ascribe risk to your suppliers, but essentially as a client, you own the risk, even if it's not in the contract. We are seeing that played out in the inquiry these days. So, but interestingly, I have said something about them not being knowledgeable and them not having the capability of buying that, and them being essentially stuck in this helpless situation. But the opportunities did present themselves in terms of them being able to kind of bridge some of that knowledge gap. They just decided not to. So was that some aspect of that incompetence or incapability? Was there some deliberate aspect to it? I think we have discussed that today. And finally, this incapability, this just kind of grows and kind of takes over this whole supply chain. It just from individual dyads to slowly cascading up and down the supply chain. When Ryden said they were essentially relying on RBKC to check that the quality of the work that was done and to sign it off. So they were hoping that RBKC had that capability. So what we are seeing is essentially people just not holding each other's accountable, and the roles and responsibilities not being very clear. A point that Judy raised at the start of this discussion today, that there's people just don't know what they're going to do, that rights and responsibilities are not kind of explicit as they should be. So now that we have talked about what we think happened, what was happening, what was the phenomena that was manifesting itself throughout the supply chain and procurement, I bring you back to this framework where we are saying that this dysfunction was manifesting up and down the supply chain, which we have shown, but also at different parts of that procurement and contract management phase. So what was missing, or what could have helped? So a point was raised initially in this discussion that when you are dealing with this atomized contractual structures, then contracts become the mechanism to manage these collaborative relationships. But is the contract, and there's this whole kind of debate about contracts always being incomplete, because again, buying more than you never know what you're going to buy and what are the problems. You can't see the future. What are the problems that are going to manifest themselves with this particular supplier? You have not worked with this supplier before, or you have, but you still don't know what's going to happen in this particular project, the nature of these projects. Are you going to then write effective contracts? Were the contracts effectively written? Our research experience tells us from some of the other industries that as partners work with each other over time, they learn how to write better contracts. They insert more safeguarding and coordination clauses in their contracts. In fact, in some of the alliance literature that we have been discussing, sorry about just going into that direction, but kind of if we kind of think about, put that into context and draw some learning from that, in some cases, they just keep the safeguarding clauses that have been kind of translated from boilerplates as such, and they just increase the number of coordination clauses because they know that it's more about how do you coordinate these activities after the contract, not just safeguarding yourself at the time of contract signing. So what I want to say is that essentially when you're trying to sign a contract, you're looking for suppliers, you're doing a search, and that search has a cost. And sometimes when you don't have the capability to negotiate that search or the time to be able to do that search effectively, the search for that solution or the search for that capability, you rely on mechanisms such as backroom conversations that we talked about today, or be able to just sign the most standard forms of contract possible that puts both parties and ultimately the people at risk. Secondly, once you have signed those contracts, and however you can design the best contract, it is always going to be incomplete, as we all know. But your responsibility as a client doesn't end with the signing of that contract. There is a build asset management, or what we say the contract management phase, which you need to be a part of and be responsible for. So there is, again, a cost to doing this ongoing monitoring and enforceability of these contracts, having these clearly defined rules and who is going to do what after this project is done as well. And that's going to play a role here. And what we kind of see from the evidence, that there were opportunities over time, over the years, to address some of these issues. These issues were raised, but never really looked at. We were learning from other failures, other projects, and there were issues being highlighted by some of the stakeholders in this project. But the monitoring and the actual checking, it did not happen, or if it did happen, it did not lead to any conclusions. Now, what could be the reason behind that? And I present these two quotes to you, which essentially say, if I want to summarize them in one line, not my job. It's like, I don't know. It wasn't my responsibility. My responsibility is to make sure that that guy is doing the work, but I'm not supposed to be ensuring the compliance of that work. And I think some of that speaks to the lack of clearly defined responsibilities. That's at least one significant component of it. Lack of clearly defined responsibilities of who is going to own what, who is going to take ownership of this part of the package, or the risk associated with that package. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is the professionalization. So I've been going on and on about, and there's a lot of stuff there out there in the press that TMO was essentially let down by its suppliers. And I'm saying that there was knowledge asymmetry and incapability on their part. They were just in the problem of buying more than they know. But does that also mean that the people who were in charge of the procurement, or without kind of saying anything in general here, the people who were in charge of this procurement, one did not have the competency or the capability to do that procurement right? And what can we do about that? So is there something to be said about having a bit more professionalization, as we see in some of the other more mature industries, a bit more professionalization around procurement, where they are bound by, not just by their organization's rules or the government regulations, which are open to interpretation, but actually an ethical professional code of conduct. They are answerable to a body of knowledge, a central body that they are answerable to. So even if there is a hidden message that you should kind of bypass this particular regulations as it was done, they say, no, it's like, we see that in lawyers, they hold each other accountable. So is there a way that procurement people can hold each other accountable? And can that organization be a driver of some of the behavioral, pushing some of the behavioral boundaries and training and nudging these procurement people, and almost kind of certifying and skill, kind of taking them off in terms of the expertise required to be able to be made responsible for these complex projects, and essentially for the livelihood, well, not just the livelihood, but the lives of people. So that's something to think about. And for example, SIPS has pushed some of the work, and unfortunately Duncan Brooks, who's leading that conversation, couldn't be with us today. But is there something that these procurement organizations, SIPS, such as SIPS, can do something about training these procurement people, or getting a kind of professionalization in place, and getting these ethical? So I said that there's one issue about saying it's not my job, or not owning that risk, but there could be another part about, maybe I don't own that risk, but it's my responsibility to look at that aspect and making sure it's right, because it's my profession. Right. So just closing off on what next. So some thoughts on, for us to discuss, or something to think about. So there is this, so can contracts be made more relational, because in this highly uncertain environment, can we have more of a relational contracting versus the traditional adversarial contracting that we see a lot in the construction world? Now, it's very easy to say for me that, okay, let's just have more relational contracts, but is it really possible in a world which is highly regulated, which promotes competition, and where the partners, no matter how good relationship you have, I'm generalizing, but no matter how good relationship you have, you will have to bid for the next contract, and that will define whether you will get that contract or not. So you can't just rely on the relationship built in this project to be carried over to the next project. It does, but you're not always sure. So in that world, would relational contracts work, or do we have to come up with a sort of framework agreement? And it's a broader conversation spanning not only the practice, but the regulatory aspects of it, where we are able to kind of create an environment for more relational contracts. Now, again, relational contracts will help against some of these incapabilities or unintended failings of procurement. But what if some of those are deliberate? Relational contracts can't help you with that. And that brings me again to that other point I made about professionalization. Now, we say that we've been saying that regulations and the laws, kind of enforced and proposed by the government can help govern some of these behaviors, procurement behaviors, or do we need another element? We need to see an interplay of professionalization versus regulation to be able to achieve what we want to achieve in this, to make this a better procurement world. So that's another sort of question for us to think about. And finally, we have seen these reviews over the years highlighting what's going wrong. And they are saying the same things with more and more compelling evidence, but we are not seeing, it's better than before, but we are not seeing the change that we should. So do we need more reviews, or do these reviews need to look at some other aspects as well, some of which have been highlighted in these in this panel discussion? So again, something to think about. So I'll just leave you with that, and thank you very much for your time. Yes.
Thank you, Jazz. Well done. Well done.
Thank you.
Manoj, Rahima, do you want to add anything to Jazz's presentation? No?
We're happy to take any questions, but nothing
Okay.
to add.
Okay. Let me just see questions. Oh, Judy has a question.
Yes, it's going to be a bit. It's a question for you, Jazz, and your co-authors, but perhaps Michael, if you want to comment as well. So the relational thing is a mess, as predicted almost. So, and you like Richard cited quite a lot of economic theory, and economic theory says very clearly that the incentives will drive behavior. Dismal science, right? But they also say very clearly that a contract is necessarily incomplete. There is no such thing as that. It is impossible to contract for the eventualities that we get, which should alert us to the fact that contractual management is not ideal. Given that, I've already asked about the role of contractors. I've said if you're going to pass the risk firmly onto them, there needs to be margin. And if there isn't, expect them to behave in the way that you have highlighted they behaved, as in with not just self-interest, but criminal negligence, very possibly. I don't want to preclude to whatever, but possibly criminal negligence. Then I think we've got to look at the role of the client in this relational business, because the client is the residual owner.
Exactly.
So the question then is the contractual management situation that you are arguing for a better relationality? Is there a need to look at okay, so the other one thing to say is, theoretically then we should be integrated. But the integration of the entire building process has never occurred in history, ever, anywhere. Even in, like, I have students who go, I come from Russia and it's all integrated. You're like, yeah, what happens to this? Like, oh, okay. Yeah. So it's never been integrated historically or any other way. So can we just look at the role of the client in terms of this relational contracting, assuming a deep-pocketed client, i.e. a client with the right property rights, so not a local council.
Yeah.
Is the relational thing possible?
I think
is the relational solution possible? Yeah.
Yes. I think my view on that is that, like everything, as a classic academic answer, it depends. like everyone.
Yeah.
But assuming that some of these constraints are not there, I think a client, we are increasingly realizing in some of the evidence that's coming up in the projects and construction world, is that client increasingly has a role to play. They can, I think, traditionally, their emphasis has been on safeguarding and just making sure that they are not at risk, or the indemnities and everything are clearly defined. But I think we are increasingly realizing that they have a more of a coordination role to play. So they need to understand that they are orchestrating these complex networks of suppliers. So I would, as a latest research on project networks revealed that they can undertake 6 activities. So they could have 2. So let me rephrase that. So they could use 2 mechanisms which would essentially orchestrate 6 activities. So they could use contracts, and then contracts would help in goal setting. And that would be, so a goal not being kind of well-defined, but goal being set and revised regularly. Then enforceability of those goals. And then constraining actions, which means that putting some some approval processes in place where supplier has to undergo sometimes cumbersome processes, but it actually has to go through a client approval, and client at least cannot claim that I didn't hear any of this. They might not choose to act on it, but they have to hear this. This communication flow, this information flow has to go through there. And then they could have these integrated project teams, which we all talk about, and they could do the other role, which is kind of monitoring, which we kind of raised a point about that, post-contract built asset management monitoring, engaging, which is making sure that there are these regular meetings with suppliers or events where these suppliers are coming, just making sure that you are a present client or an intelligent client rather than just someone who has outsourced a contract. And the third thing is, liaising with the liaising with the public bodies, making sure that they are the ones coordinating between, and that's the minimum they can do with public bodies, keeping them informed and negotiating and making that kind of information link with the supplier. So client increasingly has a role to play. That's what I wanted to say. And I can pick some of the example of it's not the best example, but before I've done some work with Hinkley Point C, but that's again managed by a private firm with its own kind of accountabilities and resources. And what I saw is that increasingly with them, there was a practice of, because all the commercial managers had come from the successful London 2012 Olympics, they kind of carried that knowledge over, and they just wanted, at least the intention is to kind of replicate the same behavior in the commercial management processes. Now they are increasingly making sure that clients know, contractors know who they are and who to come to. They've also set up this digital information sharing mechanism, and some of these provisions are in the NEC contracts, but early warnings, raise early warnings, whatever is going on, just let us know, and whatever savings, and some of the, without going into specifics, some of the contractual provisions could help in terms of, if you make, so we own the risk, they're very explicit about we own the risk as client, but if you help us reduce costs, or if you help us with early warnings and reduce that non-compliance issue, you will be rewarded. And rather than waiting till the end and then raising a big claim about it. So how can we do this more collaboratively? So information flow and making sure that your face is seen, you're responsible. Sorry for the long answer, but yeah, I just want to explain.
No, it's good. I don't want to take too long, but I just want to highlight something. Essentially, what you were saying is the client needs to make an investment in supervision, which is exactly what they're trying to avoid by contracting by management.
Yes, yeah.
So the thing is, the grim reality is you need to make you need to have the sunk costs of in this, and that's both a human capital, possibly a technology, and an informational cost.
Absolutely.
Okay, I mean, I think that the whole basis of public service contracting, particularly in public sector housing, is to avoid that cost at all costs. I mean, subcontracting is always any contracting model is always a substitute for supervision costs, which are costly. You have to retain expensive people.
Yes, yeah. Especially when it comes to the safety and lives of people. Yeah.
Adrian, you had a question. I don't want to keep Roberto hanging on too long, but Adrian, did you have a question?
Sorry.
I did have sort of more of a comment. Really. There is also a comment in the Q&A, Michael. I don't know if you can see that.
Can we come back? Can we come back to that in a moment, maybe? And I'm keen that we don't. But there's a quick comment on CDM. I mean, I suppose the point there is, but it sort of picks up the same point that Judy's been making in a different way. I mean, CDM obviously was intended to intensify the awareness of construction design safety issues and so forth throughout the process, to enhance the internalization of the rules, to use the sort of the jurisprudence. And it's all, and internalizing the sense of compliance is important, but the problem is sometimes that economics forces people to regard internalizing rules as an unnecessary cost, and there's always a tension between internalizing the rules and regarding the rules as a bit of a pain in the neck, and how can we minimize the extent to which, you know, we have this regime to try and make you internalize the need for safety and for quality, but not too much, because that might cost money. And it picks up, I'll make this short point, you just respond to your point, Judy. I think an important issue around relational contracting is, I think that because of the way English contract law works, there's, as you'll know, the English courts have tended not to be very supportive of broader, more good faith approaches to relational contracting. And there are reasons for that, which we'd have to delve into the history of English contract law. One of the problems is that we have a single contract law for public and private contracting. And we're almost unique in the world. We sort of think that's a natural consequence of the common law. It isn't. The US the US federal system has a different contract law system for performance in public contracts. The performance of public contracts in US federal law is judged by a separate, different set of contract standards and separate contract norms than would be a private contract. So this idea that the same private law has to apply across the board is just an English hang-up. But if we do that, if we try to apply the same contract rules that we apply to the sale of cocoa beans, as we like to, there's a reason why contract law is the way it is, because it's built around the sale. It historically comes from the sale of goods and shipping contracts and things. That's its roots. That we're not going to have the same. We're not going to be able to welcome in some of the broader thinkings that we might have from relational contracting, which might help. There's a real challenge here, I think, for us to take on board the broader lessons of. And so when people say, yes, relational contracting would help, yes, it would, but we don't have the right contract law system for that. Can I move on? I don't want to, because otherwise we'll run over too long, to welcome an old friend of mine, Roberto Caranta, who's a full professor of law at the University of Turin in Italy, who is a august commentator, writer, teacher of public procurement law, has been for many years. We'd be here for hours if I were to identify all of his key writings on the topic, but let's just bring right bang up to date and the sort of pertinent relevance of his work. A few weeks ago, there was published his book he edited, Public-Private Partnerships and Concessions in the EU, which includes his paper, An Intellectual History of Concessions and PPP Law. And actually, I commend it to you all because it roots some of the intellectual problems that we're dealing with in the public-private interface in the history of all of this, not going back a year or two, but it goes back further back. It goes further back than a year or two than that. Roberto, I'm glad to say, is going to be able to share with us some broader comparative lessons and a little bit of reassurance that we're not alone. Roberto.
Thank you, Michael, for your nice invitation and words. Hello, everyone, and indeed, we had possibly more than our fair share of procurement disasters in Italy. And when Mike he wrote me, inviting me to this, he was immediately thinking to the bridge in Genoa, just outside Genoa, collapsing. But it was not just that, it was actually more than that. It is really a number of disasters. I have some problem with screen sharing, never mind. I think the bridge was known all over the world, but I have another picture from San Giuliano di Puglia. It was a very, very small earthquake in 2003, and only one building collapsed. It was a school. 26 kids died. It was all the kids from that year that this municipality had. But this is something that is, I'm afraid, widespread. We have the same in the big earthquakes in L'Aquila. In L'Aquila, it was, of course, very old buildings, 17th century, 18th century, but it was a number of much newer buildings, all of them state-owned buildings. Sorry, I just have some telephone ringing. Oh, the wrong number. So it is quite common, I'm afraid, we have this kind of problem. Why this? I'm afraid a number of reasons. I'm just doing this in a crazy way, but do not worry. I think the causes are at least three. The dictator of the lowest price, floppy contract execution oversight, and a culture of litigation. What is actually happening here? Dictator of the lowest price. We didn't have Margaret Thatcher. We don't have much new public management. We have this issue with the fight against corruption. And so there was this idea, I think it is totally wrong, that lowest price is the way to fight corruption. It is a notion that is widely shared, including by the antitrust authority, but it is totally wrong. It is totally wrong because you quote unreasonably low prices when you are reasonably sure that then in the implementation of the contract, the contracting authority, the people from the contracting authority, they will just turn their head when you cut corners. And how can you be sure that they will not be seeing your poor performance? Well, basically, this is corruption. We are now, let's say, in a better legislative environment, but is kind of rather new. We took this from the 2014 directive, and we ruled out the lowest price in many cases, but it is still used. And this really links to what was said before. You have a number of public servants, and they prefer to err on the side of caution. Lowest price is automatic. No one will never accuse me of meddling with criteria. I think this is really unfortunate. Contract implementation, cutting edges. What is the problem? Lowest price bring everyone to cut edges. public buildings are built more shoddily than, let's say, private owned. Also, we don't really have a fit for purpose test drive for checking that buildings have been properly delivered. And we don't have this because indeed we didn't have Margaret Thatcher, but we cut and cut and cut into the flesh of the state machinery so that good engineers were never replaced. It was just contracting out. So there isn't really a proper contract execution oversight. Centralization, this is not for works, it's more for goods and services. It's not helping because it is removing the contracting authority from the final beneficiary. And again, as I told you, that is a prime area for corruption. Culture of litigation. This is something where we are really, partly at least, far from the UK, but you tell me. What we might be close enough is in poor contract drafting. Of course, you live, or rather, you don't really replace good people in your legal in-house offices, your in-house counsel, and the contractor will always have a better legal team. We had a number of problems. No one died, but a lot of municipalities in Italy, including local authorities in Italy, including Turin municipality, they managed to subscribe a lot of toxic financial agreements in the, like, before the financial crisis. They had no idea of what they were signing, and they thought it was, let's say, good business. Of course, it was not the case. A cultural litigation really thrive on this poor contract drafting, because actions for breaches of contract will be resisted. Public servants in contracting authority will be very shy in blacklisting poor contractors, because these will be challenged again. And we go back to an important point. I think Michael was really right in stressing this morning, or at least before the lunch break. In this case, the problem is who can litigate this. And it is not easy for competitors, even for competitors, to litigate contract implementation, because contract award, you have a lot of data, you can have right of access. Contract implementation, it is not so easy to litigate. And all these data, let's say, are elements, are the perfect recipe, if I can say so, for disaster. Of course, there is more. Thank you, Michael, for the advertisement for my book. The motorway. The motorway was kind of a compendium of everything that is wrong, plus a super cozy relationship between the motorway operator and government. The old quasi-socialist times, the motorway were state-owned, and there was a contract between the state and the motorway state-owned company. The contract was 4 pages long. The Italian motorways were privatized without changing that contract. 4 pages long. Why? Because of this cozy relationship. The government was not really looking hard on what the motorways companies were doing, or rather, more often not doing. Anyway, they didn't have the manpower to really look into that seriously. In my slide, you can see any government. Oh, no, of course. The next to last government, at least the 5 stars, they wanted to cancel the concession. It was simply impossible. No one in the state was capable of running the company, because all these people with this capacity, they have already left for the private sector or retired kind of 20 years ago. Just one last thing. It was the motorway operators that saved Alitalia when the government, because of EU state aids, could no more save Alitalia. And I thought this, oh, but this is totally crazy. You can't make money with Alitalia. These people is not just about Milton Friedman. These are suicidal types. Not a way. No. The money they put in Alitalia came back to them by, let's say, the gray negotiation on motorway extensions with the incumbent. So it is usually bad. With motorway, it was very much a toxic environment. So coming to my conclusion is, I'm afraid we really don't have easy and fast quick fix. Still something must be done. And I really go back to something that was already said. We really need to restore the professionalism, and after that, the respect for the professionalism in the public sector. Outsourcing, as Albert and Michael have shown together, is not enough. You can't buy all the expertise that is needed. So thank you very much for having me and for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. Sorry for this disaster in slide sharing, but I hope you got it, or at least most of it. Michael, the micro.
Thank you so much, Roberto. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether you've made us feel better or worse, but we are now better informed anyway. Thank you very much indeed. So our last sort of discussant commentator, Brian Richardson. Brian is a barrister who's been involved in defense of a number of high-profile cases, and he's currently very much involved in the Justice for Grenfell campaign. And Brian, over to you. Do you have Any observations sort of bringing us back to where we started? We've travelled a bit, but we're coming back. Any observations you'd want to make to bring us back to Grenfell and the problems which are emerging in the inquiry here?
Well, first of all, thanks very much to everyone for inviting me, and I'm very sorry that for different reasons I haven't been able to join the previous seminars, so apologies if some of what I have to say is something that has already been said either today or at other seminars, but I hope that it does bear some repetition. And I as an aside, Michael, I should say that I quite often felt that I was revising for exams that weren't on the syllabus.
Okay, well, that never happens when I'm tutoring. When I'm tutoring, I make sure that we only revise for the.
But let me just say this by way of prefacing what I'm going to say. Firstly, I'm not a housing expert, and I'm also not directly involved professionally in the Grenfell Tower inquiry, but I have worked with and supported a number of individuals and community groups, including the one that you mentioned, Michael, Justice for Grenfell. And let me start with what is a bit of a well-worn phrase, which I'm sure most, probably all of you have heard, which is an Englishman's home is his castle. A well-worn phrase, as I say, but of course there's an important kernel of truth in there about the importance of people's homes and why they demand protection and should be protected. But I think a more recent phrase that has been on many minds this year is the phrase Black Lives Matter. I think this seminar, and perhaps more these series of seminars, and perhaps more pertinently the tragedy of Grenfell Tower highlights the fact that housing and homes matter. You know, for those of us who practice in the justice system, we know, for example, that courts take very seriously the invasion of people's homes. And it's as true for those people living in social housing as it is for people who do live in castles. This month, here in Britain, is Black History Month, a time when there's a specific focus on the contribution that Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities have made to societies. And I think in that respect, at the centre of the modern British story is the Windrush generation and the contribution that the Windrush generation have made. My own parents are part of that generation, so that's one area that I know a bit about, and perhaps if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, I think it's worth saying something about that, because housing was always a profound issue for that generation, not just of people from the Caribbean, but other people who came from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, other parts of Europe and so on. Housing in Britain has always been a very profound issue. I know, for example, that many of the Windrush generation never actually intended to settle permanently. They intended really, and this was certainly the case for my parents, to stay for a period of time, make money that they could help to send back to support their families in the Caribbean, but crucially also to build homes themselves back on their home islands that they would return to at some later stage and retire to. Many of those people were never able to achieve those aspirations precisely because of the discrimination that they faced in this country. Discrimination that included, of course, when they went to find accommodation, signs saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, and they were left as a consequence to, if you like, the tender mercies of exploitative landlords like Peter Rackman. And I know from my dad's still alive, and when I talk to him, he talks about how it was that when he first arrived in the mid-1950s, he would find himself going to bed in a bed that was still warm from somebody who'd had to leave it to go and do their shift. Such was the level of housing poverty that they experienced. And so they had to find creative solutions to that, like clubbing together to buy houses because it was such a struggle to find them in the rented sector. And so when I was thinking about these seminars, I was looking at various papers and found one which I think had a very pertinent title by Kevin Gulliver called Racial Discrimination in UK Housing Has a Long History and Deep Roots, certainly dating back at least to the 1940s when the Windrush generation came in. And fast forwarding today, we still see a situation where homelessness is disproportionate amongst Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. Up apparently from 18% a couple of decades ago to 36% of those who are homeless today. A thing that has been highlighted by the pandemic and the concerns about social distancing and the impact that COVID-19 is having upon our communities is that, again, Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities far more likely to live in overcrowded, inadequate, fuel-poor housing than our white counterparts. A quarter of people from BAME household living in the oldest pre-1919 accommodation. 1 in 6 families from minority ethnic communities living in what are categorized, and you guys will know better than me what this means, as category 1 hazard under housing, health and the safety rating system, and over concentration in deprived neighborhoods and so on. That's the context in which we live and look at the question of social housing in Britain. Focusing specifically on Grenfell, I will never forget, I remember the middle of June 2017 very well. You may recall there'd been a very dramatic general election, rather foolishly called, you might think, by Theresa May, the Conservative Prime Minister. And then came the extraordinary events of the following week. And I remember June the 13th, it was a bright sunny day. And, you know, like so many that we are getting used to in the era of climate change, I wasn't in court that day. And so I was at home doing case preparation. And for much of that day, I was distracted by a party that was going on at the senior citizens residence just across the way from where I live. And there were different styles of music being played. There was rice, peas and chicken that was being prepared for the elders to meet. And I remember going to bed that night thinking that the sights, the sounds, the smells were precisely what make me love living in this city, living in London. I woke up the following morning to the sight of a very dear friend of mine, Moira Samuels from Ladbroke Grove, on television talking about the horror that had unfolded that she had watched literally just across the road from where she lives in Grenfell Tower. And because of that, I've spent a lot of time with Moira, with people in the Grenfell area and community. And I have been, and I'm sure others who are involved in the inquiry will bear this out, astonished and impressed by the quiet dignity and determination and knowledge of that community. They knew, people knew and demanded change in Grenfell Tower long before the fire happened. But as we know, people were treated with contempt as ignorant troublemakers, and were ostracized by various people in authority when they talked about an atrocity that they knew was waiting to happen. That is what structural racism and discrimination means in practice. We hear these fancy terms being thrown around, but that is an example of what it means in practice. And so thinking of solutions, and I was thinking when there was the question raised following Richard's presentation about how to take account of human factors, I think absolutely central has to be consultation and engagement with local communities and taking into account what they have to say about their lived experience and what they can contribute to real structural changes in society, housing, employment, all areas of society. And I think if we don't do that, then frankly, I think all bets are off about what will happen in the future. I mean, I was interested, Michael, when you were talking about the procurement process and how your feeling is that things won't change. I think that's right if the government gets away with what it intends in, if you like, the post-Brexit environment that we're moving into. But I would counter that potentially by saying that I think this pandemic has transformed the world that we live in, and that we're not going back to business as usual. And one of the other papers that I read, a very interesting paper, and I'll just check the title of it for anyone who might be interested. It's called 40 Years of Struggle, a window on Race and Housing, Disadvantage and Exclusion by Kevin Gulliver. And he says this, and it's worth quoting. The rise of race and housing needs to be set in the context of the anti-racist movement of the 1970s. Racism provided the basis for community mobilization in Black communities. One of the key elements was to secure a better housing deal for these groups, the Race Relations Act of 1976, which placed a duty on local authorities to eliminate unlawful discrimination and promote equality of opportunity. Riots in Liverpool, Birmingham and Brixton, between mainly the minority youth and the police, had a catalytic impact in linking race and disadvantage. Hence, the increased importance of race and housing should be set within the frame of legislative changes, urban disturbances and grassroots political campaigns. That's a quote from a paper by Harris Reader in 2012. I happen to live in Brixton, and I'm aware from having lived here for some time of both the changes that occurred in the aftermath of the dramatic events of 1981, but also those that are happening now with the gentrification of this area, as is happening to so much of London and other major cities. And I don't think that these processes can continue, because unless something is done about it, I think that the kind of explosions that we saw in the early 80s will happen again. I'm not encouraging and promoting these things. Of course I'm not. As a practicing barrister, it would be absolutely remiss of me to promote those kind of things. But these things happen regardless of whether we wish them to happen or not, in circumstances, I think, where people feel bitterness and anger and frustration. My early years of practice as a criminal barrister coincided with the uprisings that exploded across England in 2012 in the aftermath of the killing of Mark Duggan in Tottenham. And I remember that at the time, before Duggan was killed, there was a feeling of frustration in urban communities. I think, certainly with all of the frustrations and the anxiety that people are feeling around coronavirus, that there is a whiff of that in the air again, a sense of desperation in our communities. And therefore, there is a challenge to us to find and to offer radical solutions, and solutions, I think, that take into account the perspectives of Black, Asian, minority ethnic and working class communities. And I think that that is one of the challenges for those contributing to the inquiry. I mean, one other inquiry is worth mentioning, and it's one that certainly Sam, I don't know if Sam's still a part of this discussion here, but Sam and I will know something about, because our fellow member of our chambers is Michael Mansfield QC, who was the lead counsel to the Stephen Lawrence family at the time of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry in 1998, the conclusion of which in 1999, Sir William Macpherson talked about the existence of institutional racism. Of course, the very fact that we're talking about these matters here today, the fact that the discussion about racism is so central to the Grenfell Tower inquiry, is a clear indication of the fact that simply publishing an inquiry, as Macpherson didn't eradicate racism, but it did at least put the question and the issue of racism on the agenda in a very profound way. I think that the pandemic, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement has once again put those issues onto the agenda in a very profound way. The Grenfell Tower inquiry has put them on the agenda in a very profound way. And it gives us no guarantee, but at least the opportunity that if we bring together the kind of perspectives that have been discussed at these seminars, the kind of perspectives that I think the community is bringing to the Grenfell Tower inquiry, it gives us the opportunity to develop real, radical and lasting solutions. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for listening to me.
Unmute, Michael.
Very much indeed, Brian. Thank you very much. That's a very pertinent observation. And I mean, and I was just struck with thinking while you were speaking about. I will take it as an optimistic observation that you think, that you're saying that things will have to change and will change. And it is striking, isn't it, when you think of, say, 1945-47, when housing was at the core of government work in this country, and going right back to the time of Windrush, that it was the Ministry of Health. It was Aaron Bevan as Minister of Health who put housing at the top of the agenda. Here we are in the middle of a great, maybe arguably not the greatest health emergency we've had since 1947. Will all governments, not just central government, but all government bodies, rise to the challenge of meeting that housing challenge going forward with all that it? The problem, of course, will be build the housing, but can it be of the requisite quality? Because that's the trade-off, which unfortunately didn't work in Grenfell and didn't necessarily work in 1947 either. That's going to be the real challenge going forward. So any more? I don't think I see any more questions or chats items. Any more thoughts? Any more requests? Any more observations? Can I invite this? It's always difficult on these Zoom events to know how you show your appreciation for this wonderful panel in the usual way, because I don't know what the usual way is other than shake the screen very loudly or something or other. But anyway, well, thank you very much indeed, everyone. It's been a fantastic. I hope that that this has been a useful contribution to the overall project. And Vanessa, over to you for some final words.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'm just going to ask for a quick steer from my co-conveners here. It's 2:25. Shall I just do a 30-second wrap, or do you want me to go back over the last 2 weeks and today and bring the threads together, or not? We could always post that on the website later.
I think it'd be good for you to do it, but because I don't think time is the most essential issue here, but maybe I don't know how everybody else is. So
I agree.
Okay, all right, well, I'll do that then. Well, thank you for that. So as I say, it falls to me to try to draw together a few final observations across all three of the seminars. But before doing so, let me extend a huge thank you to the behind the scenes team at Bangor and the Bartlett, especially Tracy Williams and Chizoba Onyuke. We could not have done it without you ladies. Thank you. I thank also our panelists today and all those who contributed to the previous seminars. Most importantly, I want to thank very much our audience over the 3 weeks. Your participation, your observations, your challenges have been very stimulating, sometimes humbling, and always extremely constructive. And I hope that you've drawn benefit of one kind or another from the series. What have we learned? Well, I have to say for myself, there have been moments during the series where I've thought somewhat despairingly that perhaps as a society, we've learned very little about how to organise that very basic need of putting a roof over our heads ever. The large historical sweeps that we've seen from the 17th to the 21st centuries seem to have pointed to making the same mistakes, adopting the same paradigms time and time again. Will it be different this time? How can we ensure it will be? Perhaps the points that Brian made give us optimism that this time it will be different. I've been repeatedly struck by the value of a very rich, multi and interdisciplinary framing of aspects of the tragedy that we've seen in the series of seminars. We've had, for example, an international perspective. Miles Glendinning in our opening paper, and Roberto finally today, but Miles on the 9th of October took us to Sweden and Hong Kong via London, Paris, Moscow and Glasgow, looking at different political models for social housing and noting its apparently ever descending status in the UK. But he showed that there's no inevitability in the outcome for people in the built environment. So good outcomes ought to be within our grasp if the political will is present. Eva Branscombe talked of what she called the complicated palimpsest that's the history of housing in the area of London where Grenfell Tower stands, a different and evocative analogy for the repeating patterns of problem and solution definition. New layers were added to that painting before us by a series of socio-historical and sociological contributions. James Greenhalgh showed us how the idea of the tenant was constructed over time and how notions of determinism have been at play, with rich examples from the 1930s to the present day and language and terminology telling us all. Alan Ephraim showed us how what we might popularly think of as a radical shift in the policy landscape in 1979 was actually an entirely logical culmination of post-war policies, which were underpinned by a principle of correction of market failure rather than the principle of ensuring a minimum living standard for all, and which produced ever greater levels of social segregation. Shaila Rosena was uniquely placed as both an academic and a local resident, and she gave us new insights into the concept of gentrification, tracing its lineage from colonial organisation of urban space to what she called facadism of our times, and showing us how the nexus of race, class and gentrification is poorly understood and crying out for more empirical research. And whilst we've learned much, and importantly, focusing on race and class, we've actually barely touched on, for example, social segregation by age or disability, and those might well be the subject of future empirical consideration too. Sam Wetherill showed us how to map, in every sense, the entrenching of racial inequality in social housing and the cumulative impact of the economic subjugation that has gone hand in hand with that. And how ironic was that? Gus John reminded us forcefully, and Brian's reinforced it, that the communities of the global south who've arrived in the UK had a very different attitude to the place where they expected to be born, to live and to die, and did not want to or aspire to state support. Their homes were and are social and cultural assets, not capital ones. So how then does the state manage its intervention? Through the regulation of building safety, engineering, architecture and design, fire safety and social housing provision? That was the theme of the second set of seminars last week. Holly Smith had scoured local authority and private archives to bring us a deconstruction, and I use that word quite deliberately, of the symbols of post-war growth and modernisation in her exposition of the Ronan Point disaster, suggesting that while some engineering lessons might have been learnt since then, political and cultural ones clearly had not been. Corruption in contracting, paternalism towards tenants who are not listened to, poor communication between government and residents, those were features in the 1960s as they are today. Shane Ewan helped us to an understanding of the development of building and more especially fire safety regulation and its phases since the 19th century. The loss of the fundamental research capacity and standard setting, and the loss of avenues for independent, disinterested advice to government, ever-changing jurisdictions, the focus on the usage of a building rather than inherent aspects of its design to determine the regulation of risk, shifts in this area as in so many others towards outcomes-focused regulation, and in this case with very significant measures of self-regulation from the industries involved. In 40 years, he said, we'd gone from significant certainty about rights and obligations to almost total uncertainty and sloping shoulders, not taking responsibility at every turn, from disaster recovery to disaster endurance. Stefan Mutesius mapped that regulatory evolution to the corresponding evolution in architectural opinion for us in the development of towers for the welfare state. And Peter Apps, in his extempore commentary, was able to position each of the more recent regulatory phases right back into the heart of Whitehall departments and governments. He challenged us with two simple facts. Media interest sees high-rise buildings in terms of the property market, not fire safety, and non-prescriptive standards seem to have produced the wrong results. We actually owe so much to committed specialist journalists like Peter, and I think all of us listening would want to thank him for what he does. Carl Macon gave us a stimulating theoretical framework for those trends in regulation and brought us right up to date with a detailed analysis of the approach to social housing regulation since the Cave Review in 2007. He showed us just how much risk-based regulation is not neutral in a highly original and detailed study of sector risk profiles issued by the social housing regulator since 2012. What drives their approach is welfare reform, market exposure and diversification, debt and liquidity, and management of the existing stock. And even post-Grenfell, the centrality of finance and competition drives the risk outlook of the social housing regulator. Crucially, the current regulatory regime excludes socio-cultural risks, that is, harm to collective and individual well-being. And in the few instances where there is individualization of risk, the current regulatory regime transfers that risk onto the most vulnerable and the least able to bear the risk. We closed last week's session with a global academic perspective and with a critical technical contribution from the Fire Brigades Union. Narendra Puja and his team reminded us how many high-rise fires there had been in the last decades across the globe and gave us alarming statistics about the extent of multiple and hidden defects in, for example, high-rise buildings in New South Wales and Victoria, Australia. The similarly prevalent performance-based regulatory regime had similar holes: low compliance levels, poor technical oversight of standards, inadequate and improvised decision documentation. Regulatory regimes have evolved from the expensive and professional through the bureaucratic and to the apparently less costly political. Now, to pose the fundamental question which the current regimes invite: how do you achieve accountability when non-regulatory actors assume key roles? And that question has not, in my view, been adequately answered in the bill going through Parliament here in England and Wales right now. Nor does it address the need, highlighted very clearly by Sam Steen last week, to ensure that a key regulatory role is assumed by the tenant voice. Where is the model for participatory co-regulation, which might start to address that exclusion of sociocultural risks or repair the economic subjugation that we've seen? Matt Rack provided a rare and hugely valuable set of insights into the fire service. He noted the extent to which the decline in fire deaths since the Blitz had been the key driver for government policy, with apparent change points arising out of specific disastrous incidents and rounded off more recently, of course, by austerity. Risk management had become budget management, no better exemplified by the fact that the London Fire Brigade now has only 2 fire engineers. In prescient anticipation of today's papers, Julie Stevenson last week gave us a fascinating historical insight into 17th, 18th and 19th century handling of building contracting. She showed us models which appeared to defy normal economic principles, arbitrage and corruption and the playing out of principal and agent relationships, and also that there's nothing new in the conundrum that all regulators face. How on earth do you keep up with technical innovation by those you regulate for the benefit of the public that they and you serve? So today's papers have, of course, focused much more on those business models and how services are procured and actors held accountable. I'm not going to summarize those because you've all been listening today, but I'm personally struck by 2 things. Firstly, that value engineering seems really to have meant the engineering of values. We've not balanced efficiency and equity, accountability and capability, the relational and the adversarial, commercial values and public values in a way that supports collective and individual well-being. And we seem to have hardwired into our systems legal and process barriers to being able to do that balancing as well. Secondly, I note that across 3 weeks, no one has argued for less regulation, but it's very clear that there's much work to be done on what on earth the best regulatory model might be. So we've covered much ground over 3 short weeks, a fraction of the time of the public inquiry, of course. But I think we hope that we've offered some new lenses through which to consider what we've learnt to date and will yet learn from the main inquiry. Our website will continue to have the recordings of the sessions and the accompanying materials, so do feel free to go back at your leisure. Once again, my thanks to today's speakers and to all those from the previous weeks, to my fellow organisers and to all those of you who have listened and participated. Good afternoon.
Well
So
done for
I
that.
think, Gisela, if you can take us out of broadcast mode, that would be helpful. And then the panelists might just want a quick debrief.